For this video, we've picked a few of our favourite medieval stories that we've covered on the channel over the past few years to create a giant compilation for you to enjoy. From the inner workings of medieval pubs, taverns and inns, to the life of medieval teenagers and medieval soldiers, all the way to the medieval's opinions on sex, saints, seasons and space. Here is a huge video covering all areas of the medieval era. But first, a quick message from our sponsor, me. When I'm not diving into medieval history with you every Friday evening, I keep myself busy working on various musical projects. I play guitar and sing my own songs for my new band Default Mode Network, and our debut single Weight of Gold has just come out today as this video goes live. We have a couple more singles coming out this year too before our EP at the start of next year. I've put a lot of work into this, and the more streams, saves and being put in playlists that we can get, the more ears the track will get pushed out to. So for any fans of guitar or rock music, please check us out using the link down below. And if you do, please let me know what you think. Thanks everyone, and now for today's video. Welcome to Medieval Madness. During the Middle Ages, ale was the most popular drink in England, and medieval taverns, inns and alehouses held a very important role in society, providing drink, food and lodging to weary travellers, pilgrims and even occasionally royalty. When we think of the medieval tavern, we imagine dark and smelly places with huge wooden tables and benches, places of gambling, violence and shady business deals. But what were pubs really like in the Middle Ages? Let's travel back in time for some leather mugs, a bit of royal paranoia and the occasional stabbing. Welcome to Medieval Madness. Holy Last Orders. It was important for medieval monasteries to provide hospitality to visitors. It was a way of fulfilling their spiritual obligations and keeping in touch with any news from the outside world. Allowing any important visitors access to stay was also a good way of gaining patronage. Providing food, ale and a safe place to sleep within the precinct walls became linked to the idea of pilgrimage in the early Middle Ages. Having a shrine that people could visit meant that pilgrims might offer up some money or maybe even donate a parcel of land to the order if they were rich enough and treated well enough. Any income coming into the monastery was always welcome. Sometime in the early 13th century, abbots started to realise that as well as accepting donations, they could charge pilgrims and other travellers a fee for their accommodation. So monasteries started to build purpose-made structures to lodge their visitors in. They were sort of like a modern-day hotel with food and drink provided. Gaining a good reputation as a place for first-class hospitality was important to any abbot, as they wanted to be seen as being generous to their guests, and more importantly, they wanted repeat business. Because of their importance and because they were home to numerous monastic orders, cities like those of London and York found themselves inundated with guests. Others in more obscure or isolated places found themselves in debt, which resulted in a situation where rich visitors were still welcomed, but poorer travellers were turned away from the abbey gates. It was usual for visitors to leave on the third day of their stay, and they were only expected to remain longer if they were ill or the weather was so bad that it would be dangerous to leave. Only monks were allowed to stay longer, but it was very difficult to throw out a visiting bishop or members of royalty. The abbot probably welcomed any wealthy guests with open arms, as he was expected to dine with them during their stay, and on those occasions he didn't have to stick to the usual monotonous monastic diet. During visits, monks were not allowed to interact with any female guests, and women were forbidden from entering the monastic cloisters, whose walkways formed a barrier between the realm of the monks and the outside world. The guest, master and cellarer were responsible for providing suitable food and drink to the visitors, who were housed depending on their status. Those with more than 14 horses were given access to the abbot's house, and guests were provided with candles and often given tours of the monastery. Most of the monastic orders had their own brew houses, and the monks themselves drank copious amounts of ale, anything between 8 and 16 pints a day. There was a huge amount of drinking going on, and really these monastic hostelries were the genesis of the British pub. Alewives. Ale was an integral part of the daily diet in the Middle Ages, and in the early medieval period, most brewers were women. The first record of the word alewife was in 1393 and meant a woman that keeps an alehouse. This was not the sort of purpose-built pub structure that we know today. It would just be a case of the wife brewing ale for her family in a domestic house setting in the countryside where most people lived. If there was a surplus of ale, then she might share it with the rest of the villagers or even sell it to passers-by. These small alehouses would raise an ale stake or ale pole above the door to let people know that a brew was ready. Women were in charge of all the kitchen chores such as grinding grain, making dough, baking bread, and growing herbs. For economic reasons, it seems only sensible to use any surplus grain for other things like brewing ale rather than wasting it. Some householders improvised by making a drinking area for customers inside their own domestic homes. With the expansion of towns, it wasn't long before the idea of charging a fee to provide beer caught on. In the early Middle Ages, most serfs were bound to their lord's land, so there wasn't much need for travel. But by the 14th century, and especially after the Black Death, travelling became more popular and the need for inns and alehouses grew. There were long stretches of countryside between villages, and especially on the more well-used roads into major towns, the need for a safe overnight place to sleep was a must. In Today, Tavern Tomorrow. For the most part, inns provided sleeping accommodation with hot food being served, taverns served wine and were more drink-focused, and alehouses, well, alehouses sold ale. In smaller towns, inns were usually in a central location or at a crossroads. They became an economic hub, playing an essential role in an area's social and political life. Many uprisings would begin with a heated debate within an inn, as did a lot of drunken violence. Like these smaller alehouses, taverns would place a pole decorated with leaves known as a bush above the door. It's thought that this may have been used for stirring the brew. Later, they would display a sign outside with a memorable motif. This was essential at the time, as the majority of customers would have been illiterate. In the densely populated capital of London, there were numerous taverns and hostelries. In an important trading city, they would be frequented not just by locals but also by thousands of visitors that passed through every year. Ale was usually served in mugs made from wood or leather. Unlike inns, taverns served wine which had to be imported from France, where it was consumed every day, and was more expensive, so taverns attracted more wealthy patrons. Most inns had a kitchen and would serve simple, low-quality food like pottage, bread and cheese, or salted fish to build up a thirst. Roasted meats or bacon might be added to the pottage or served in pies. Plates might be made from wood, or they could be trenchers made from stale bread. Customers were expected to bring their own knife and spoon or eat with their hands. Inside, taverns and inns would have been gloomy places, cold in winter but cool in summer, with the only sources of light and heat being candles and a centrally located fire. Large trestle tables and benches provided somewhere to sit whilst eating and drinking. The mixture of smells from the floor of straw rushes would have been eye-watering and probably made up of horse manure, body odour and spilled rotten food, along with some sour ale. Most inns had stables, and in 1324 the owners of these sorts of hostelries were allowed to charge 2 pence to provide enough hay for 1 horse for a day and a night. Most innkeepers in London were men, although there are records of 2 women running hostelries. In the Holborn district during the 1330s, Beatrice Hind ran an inn, and Isabel Toppersham ran one in the ward of Baynard's Chastel near St Paul's Brewhouse. Sleeping accommodation was catered for in the chamber, which usually comprised several straw beds in a communal back room. But there were private rooms too, as not all guests were just passing through. A man named William Birbeck, who came from the county of Kent, rented a room at the inn owned by John Waltham. William arrived in the spring of 1345 and was charged 1.5 pence a week for the long-term accommodation, for which he was given his own room key. Inside his room, William, who it appears was a man of some wealth, felt safe enough to leave his valuables in his deposit box. Inside were silver and gold rings, silver ornaments, silk girdles and purses, and 10 marks in cash. Unfortunately, whilst William was out, someone unlocked the door to his chamber and stole the box. Waltham, the innkeeper, who was liable for the property owned by his guests, blamed his brewer Roger because he was the only other person who had a key. Royal regulations. The rent of 1.5 pence per week seems quite reasonable when compared with the 12 pence that King Edward II gave to Beatrice Goss. She was the wife of one of his servants, and it was what she was charged for spending just 4 nights in London in accommodation. In the spring of 1338, King Edward III was away abroad for what was to be the beginning of the 100 Years' War, and safety measures were put in place in the capital. So the better men of every ward were sent out to make sure that all innkeepers were not harbouring persons for whom they cannot answer. The procedures went further, and in 1343 a law was passed that taverners had to warn their guests to leave their arms in their inns before going into the streets. At that time, no one was allowed to walk around inside London city walls armed, and tavern owners were reminded that they were responsible for making sure that any of their guests, who might be from outside of the area, were aware of the regulations. Then later in December of the same year, the 24 aldermen of London were warned that all the hostelers and innkeepers in their wards needed to be of good fame, as they were under obligation to report any suspicious characters and not allow any wrongdoers in their lodgings. Whenever the king stayed in London with his huge retinue of hundreds of people, his marshals would enter the city and appropriate enough inns and private households for them to stay in. They marked the front of each place with chalk. Edward probably got the idea from his father King Edward II, who had his marshals seize a number of London inns for lodging the great folk on the occasion of his coronation. The great folks were allowed to stay with their attendants for free until 4 days after the event. When ale's in, wit's out. Even today, pubs are often associated with antisocial behaviour and violence, and the Middle Ages were no different. In 1272, Robert Bernard attacked and killed Ralph, who was the son of a vicar, with an axe, and at the Tavern of Annias in Nottingham in 1301, a man named Walter Emily was stabbed to death. His killer fled to Scotland and joined the army, where he was later pardoned by the king for good service. Then in 1306, Thomas Blendersow was thrown out of his house and expelled from the area because he went to the tavern at night, got drunk and was quarrelsome and a nuisance to the neighbours. It would seem that Mayor Johann Blount, who heard Thomas's case, liked to come down hard on people who regularly became drunk and disturbed the peace. Thank you for watching this episode of Medieval Madness. Apologies if my voice sounds absolutely destroyed, I've just gotten back from 5 days at Glastonbury Festival and I'm suffering. Please subscribe if you'd like to learn more about medieval history, and I'll see you next week for another video. Cheers! It's hard being a teenager. Coping with raging hormones, insecurities and acne whilst trying to figure out just who you are and where you fit in society is no joke. It's not really the best time to try and make important choices about your future. So just imagine what being a teenager was like without the comfortable modern amenities that we have today. Let's face it, in medieval Europe you were lucky to have even reached your teens when childhood mortality was so high. The concept of adolescence was pretty much ignored in early medieval society. By the age of 12, in the eyes of the law, you were considered an adult. People died young and many children were left without one or even both parents before they hit puberty, some were orphaned before they were even born. Let's travel back in time now to see what it was like for the youth of the Middle Ages and why teenagers were given away to strangers and freshers had their teeth forcibly removed. Welcome to Medieval Madness. You're never too young. Towards the end of the medieval period, around the year 1500, the Venetian ambassador wrote about what he believed to be a strange type of parenting that he had experienced during his time in England. He said English families kept their children at home till the age of 7 or 9 at the utmost, and then put them out, both male and females, to hard service in the houses of other people, binding them generally for another 7 or 9 years. He observed that this happened irrespective of the family's status and wealth, noting, quote, "Everyone, however rich he may be, sends away his children into the houses of others, whilst he, in return, receives those of strangers into his own." The doubtful Italian was told that it was for the good of the child, although he believed that the English chose to do this because having other people's children in the house meant that they could work them hard and feed them less. This sort of cross-system of child raising was quite common across the north of Europe in the Middle Ages. Only a small minority of children went away to study at university or joined the clergy. Most were sent away to other homes to work as apprentices and servants. Usually they were older than the Venetian ambassador suggests, though being about 12 or 14. For peasants, the greatest motivation for waving off their children appears to have been financial. Having one less mouth to feed in a medieval household was always a bonus. But for some who genuinely believed that they were helping their child, and who had a little more money, they would save up and buy their offspring an apprenticeship. It seems that medieval teenagers were a source of cheap labour. After the Black Death struck in 1350, hiring a live-in apprentice made a lot of sense when, with a drop in population, hired workers became more expensive, but food became cheaper. Troubled teens. Perhaps there was a feeling that although parents could teach their children life skills, different and better things could be learned if they had training from someone else. Or maybe it was a way for parents to rid themselves of disobedient teenagers. There was a belief that it was easier for strangers to rear and educate children even in 14th century Italy. Paolo of Certaldo, a Florentine merchant, advised, quote, "If you have a son who does nothing good, deliver him at once into the hands of a merchant who will send him to another country, or send him yourself to one of your close friends. Nothing else can be done. While he remains with you, he will not mend his ways. Some teenagers were actually contractually forced to behave. In Northampton, England in 1396, the mayor witnessed a contract between a coppersmith named John Hindley and his apprentice Thomas. Hindley became a guardian to Thomas and promised to feed him, train him in his craft, and not punish him too harshly when he made mistakes. In return, Thomas had to promise not to run away, gamble, steal, visit prostitutes, or get married. If he broke the terms of the contract, then the length of the apprenticeship would double from 7 to 14 years. But for many young men, several years of celibacy was just too much, and apprentices earned a reputation for hanging around in taverns and reveling in shameless behaviour. For most teenagers, leaving their parents would probably be a traumatic event. One wrote, quote, "For all that was to me a pleasure when I was a child, from 3 years old to 10, while I was under my father and mother's keeping, be turned now to torments and pain." But he was one of the lucky ones that could write down his feelings and communicate with his parents at home. For most servants and apprentices who were illiterate, there was no way to keep in contact with their families. Even if they were only living a few miles away, they could feel abandoned and lonely. With puberty comes great responsibility. Although teenagers were considered to be immature, there are many examples of them being considered responsible enough to be made rulers. In 1483, Charles VIII of France became king at just 13. John of Bohemia was married and made king in 1410 at the age of 14, he was then made Count of Luxembourg at 17. The English military, which was well known for putting older, more experienced men in command, followed Edward the Black Prince at the Battle of Crécy in 1346, when he was only 16. Edward was regarded as one of the greatest knights of his age despite his youth, and won the accolade of being one of the most successful English commanders during the 100 Years' War and a paragon of chivalry from his contemporaries. Even some medieval girls were considered mature enough to be given positions of power. Joanna I became Queen of Naples in 1343. Joan of Arc led an army at the age of just 17, and many more boys and girls rose to power during the Middle Ages, including an emperor. Old before their time. Most elite women were inclined to marry younger than women from other social groups because of the need for political unions. Those in the highest levels of French and English society often married on or before the age of 12. At this point, they were considered to be an adult and were expected to behave as one. Of course, many elite boys also married at a young age, but expectations were different for them, and their carefree adolescence did not finish so suddenly. They were usually allowed to continue their tutoring and unruly behaviour after marriage. Henry Bracton, the 13th century jurist, wrote that a girl became a woman when she took on the responsibilities of a household. He was one of the few writers who bothered with the subject of a woman's life cycle at all. Women were considered to be in their prime during adolescence. It was a time when they were believed to be at their most physically beautiful and spiritually pure. Both a girl's virginity and youth were tied together. Once she was married and was no longer a virgin, then she was thought to have left behind the most perfect age of her life. It seems that for the medievals, the change from adolescent girl to adult woman came about because of their relationships with men, at the point when they left their family or apprenticeships and became wives. Misspent youth. The Manual Scholarium is a 15th century Latin text that was written in Germany. It is a how-to guide on being a student, a handbook on how to prepare for and better understand the term ahead. It's written in the form of a series of conversations, mainly between two students named Bartholdus and Camillus, who discuss aspects of their student lives at the University of Heidelberg. Among the many issues covered are enrollment, the minimum attendance required without getting into trouble, exams, university rules, how to get along with housemates, expenses for bread, books and the local craft beer, and women. One of the most interesting conversations between our two young scholars involves the initiation ceremony for new students called knocking off the horns. It was meant as a way of encouraging the latest recruits to learn humility and good behaviour by discarding their most uncultured and childish features. In the discussion, the baby-faced Venus, what we would call a fresher today, is cruelly insulted and humiliated by two older boys who accuse him of being a foolish, pathetic, foul-smelling, ugly animal. With Camillus asking, "What's the stink that's smelling up this place? There's either been a corpse rotting here or a goat, the filthiest of beasts." Bartholdus happily joins in the harassment, adding that the fresher has weak legs and resembles a little old woman bowed with age. The two tormentors decide that the new scholar must be purged and have his horns surgically removed, his teeth pulled out, his beard shaved off, and confess his horrible crimes before he can join their, quote, praiseworthy society of students. The fresher was made to wear a hood with horns and had boar's teeth inserted into his mouth, after which they would be knocked off or polished with oversized tools such as an axe and pliers. Many new students were injured because of this. At the end of the ritual, the fresher was forced to buy dinner and wine for the masters and older students as atonement for his sins. Teenage kicks. This type of initiation that we know today as hazing, or at the very least bullying, was not an isolated incident and happened all over Northern Europe. In Paris, where it was a particular problem, rules were brought in to stop physical and verbal abuse against freshers, in the chapter, in the dormitory, in the schoolroom, and in the gardens. Although the fact that the penalty for calling professors drunks at the Sorbonne University was to buy everyone a round of drinks, shows that the Parisian rulebook wasn't really followed that strictly. German students were banned from flinging feces and pouring urine on younger scholars. In Avignon at the College of St. Nicholas, newcomers were made to serve dinner to the older scholars and put up with the embarrassment of being treated like a servant. And in various universities, a newcomer stumping up the cash to pay for a banquet for everyone else seemed to be quite normal. This was especially true for the freshers at Heidelberg, who had a new hazing ritual in 1419 that involved a student paying for his fellow college members to visit the local baths. As this was a euphemism for the collective hiring of a group of prostitutes, this can hardly be seen as a lesson in morality. And this was despite most establishments having rules against the excessive consumption of alcohol, taking part in gambling games, and engaging in sex workers. Costs were taken into consideration though, and in 1365 at Orleans, a rule was brought in to make sure that whatever financial forfeits were imposed on freshers, they were never made to spend so much money that they were forced to sell all of their books. University initiations were meant to have an important purpose in society by getting medieval youths ready for life in the real world. One historian suggests that the Manual Scholarium was written to help new students fit into the daily routines and customs of university life, and avoid the older wolves who were ready to pounce on them at the start of their education. And what better way was there to teach these lessons and shape teenagers into men than by learning about money, alcohol, being rude to professors, and gossiping about the evils of menstruating women. Thank you for watching this episode of Medieval Madness. Please subscribe if you haven't, and I'll see you next week for another video. Hope you have a great week. Cheers. A lot of medieval cities were similar to ours today in that they had governing bodies, educational structures, bankers, lawyers, hospitals, merchants, and an exchange of goods and services, as well as some extraordinary cathedrals that are still standing today. Though the medievals themselves were unsure about the advantages of their cities. The English chronicler and monk Richard Devise wrote about London in the 1190s and said, quote, "Whatever evil or malicious thing that can be found in any part of the world, you will find it in that one city." So what was life like for these medieval metropolitans? Let's travel back in time and find out. Welcome to Medieval Madness. At the beginning of the Middle Ages, about 90% of Europeans lived in the countryside in religious communities or on feudal land. But by the time we reached the High Middle Ages in the 11th century, that number had fallen as more business opportunities opened up and trade overseas expanded. Then more people decided to migrate to the towns and cities in search of a better way of life. Many villages had grown up outside of manors, castles or monasteries and along trade routes. Over time, these villages later became towns and cities that were enclosed within a protective wall interspersed with towers that would have arrow slits for defense. Access to a medieval city was usually controlled through gates. Inside the walls, it would be crowded with streets and buildings, usually with a central cathedral. Safety. Most people in the cities were either born free or were a peasant who had escaped from a manor in the countryside. Peasants or serfs who lived on a piece of land were required to work for the lord of the manor. In return for this, they had the right to cultivate that plot of land for their provisions, but they also had to work on their lord's fields. Serfs could not leave the land that they were bound to and were only allowed to marry with their lord's permission. It is no surprise then that many serfs ran away to the cities whenever they got the chance. As cities grew, the authorities encouraged people to relocate by offering any peasant the opportunity to become a freeman. If they left their rural community and resided within the city for a year and a day without being claimed by their lord, they could gain their freedom. However, the last thing that someone who was essentially a runaway slave would want to do as they entered the city walls was to announce themselves and record their name and the date. Otherwise, your lord could send his steward or bailiff looking for you and easily find out that you were somewhere within the city. But the cities needed workers to function properly, so the powers that be organised many hush-hush under-the-table lists of people who were waiting for their year and a day of freedom. Some bailiffs and stewards were even accepting bribes from the city authorities to encourage serfs to leave their farms and migrate to the cities. Crowded. Today in 2023, our idea of a city is somewhere like Delhi in India with a population of over 16 million people, or New York with over 19 million. Medieval cities were tiny in comparison. In Europe, there were about 15 to 20 cities that housed about 25,000 people. In Spain, the cities on the 250,000 resident list included Valencia and Barcelona. In Germany, Cologne and Nuremberg. And in France, Bordeaux and Toulouse, among others. In England, by 1300, York and Bristol were the second largest cities, but only housed around 10 to 12,000 people each. In comparison, the capital London had grown to accommodate between 80 and 100,000. Although figures took a huge dip in the middle of the century when the first wave of the Black Death pandemic hit. In 1339, King Edward III called London the mirror and exemplar of the whole realm. In about 1100 though, London shared the same number of citizens of around 40,000 inhabitants as its trading cities of Bruges and Ghent, which were just across the English Channel. This was not a coincidence as the three cities had a close trading relationship. Raw wool was manufactured in the rural areas of England before being transported to London. Then it would be loaded and shipped down the Thames River and across the Channel to the textile cities of Bruges and Ghent, where it would be processed and made into clothing. Some of that clothing would be shipped out across Europe and some would find its way back to England, so it makes sense that the three cities were roughly the same size. Stinky. Most medieval cities might now be home to great opportunities and wealth, but they were also rife with squalor. They were noisy, crowded places with a hodgepodge of narrow streets stuffed full of houses. Some had yards where pigs and other animals were kept. They were smelly, packed full, and a breeding ground for disease. Even though the scientific discovery of bacteria was still centuries away, the medievals soon came to understand that waste was filthy and certainly not pleasant to be around, especially in cities on a warm summer's day. This prompted stricter criteria for the disposal of wastewater. But from 1371 in London, there was no more throwing it out of bedroom windows onto the people passing below. Yes, it could be disposed of in the central drainage channels that ran down most of the city streets, but get caught chucking it out rather than walking downstairs with it and you would be fined 2 shillings. Following the understandable paranoia of disease after the Black Death, householders in London and York were officially held liable for keeping the area outside of their own front door clean. In Coventry, any man that did not clean the pavement outside of his home with a broom and a bucket on a Saturday was fined 12 pence. That was okay for the side streets, but what about the busy thoroughfares, jam-packed with people and horses and all of the rubbish that they created? In 1372, London came up with the idea of organising its first refuse collection. Publicly funded by using the money raised from the fines on dodgy brewers, 24 horses and 12 carts were purchased to start a waste management scheme. Weekly rubbish collections also occurred in York and Norwich, whilst in Coventry the cart came by on a Saturday, probably to align with the enforced cleaning day. Rubbish was to be kept inside the home until the carts arrived. Demand had grown so much that by the early 16th century, collections in London had increased to 3 times a week. Despite these measures, there was no way to regulate the behaviour of the hundreds of visitors that came into the towns and cities every day with their dogs, pigs, horses and poultry. Their litter let an adequate amount of work for the many scavengers and muckrackers who had to collect their detritus from the filth-ridden streets and take the feces, soil and debris by boat or cart and deposit it outside of the city walls. Violent. The murder rate rose unrelentingly towards the end of the 14th century. Murder along with theft and assault became a serious problem for the medieval city dweller. Curfews were used to try and keep citizens safe from strangers, and a bell would be rung to allow people to hurry back to their homes before the city gates were closed and locked. But sometimes the dangers were a lot closer to home and came from a citizen's own neighbours. Many residents became quite protective over the state of their cities, and arguments would often break out, some becoming quite heated and violent. In London in 1322, the son of a goldsmith called William relieved himself into a pot and then threw the urine onto the shoes of a passerby. A row erupted and Philip de Assendone, who tried to intervene, was killed by a wound that was penetrating to the brain, just for trying to make the peace. An eel seller from Hampton named Roger Styward also met a sticky end. He was caught on Cordwainer Street in London, fly-tipping eel skins in front of 2 shops. One of the shopkeepers chased him into a nearby churchyard and gave him such a brutal beating that Roger was only able to manage to lurch a few steps to Cheapside before he dropped dead. Simon de Warfield continued to throw his rubbish into the street despite several warnings. He called his aldermen rude names after being arrested in 1343. Similarly, Beatrice Langbourne called her alderman a broken-down old yokel when she was charged with the same offence 30 years later. William Emery, a poulterer known for littering the London streets with heron, horse and goose dung, really got on his neighbour's nerves when he threw out, quote, "horse piss that had stood under his horse a month or 6 weeks so that no man could pass." Perhaps it could be called poetic justice then when Johann Tolly fell to his death in 1326 whilst urinating out of his window into the street. The authorities at London in 1414 were so set on cleaning up their filthy streets that they even offered a reward for snitching on waste-dumping neighbours. Anyone willing to grass on a litterer was given 2 shillings and 4 pence as payment, and an extra 12 pence out of the culprit's 4 shillings fine. That little incentive would have been worth about £100 today and probably resulted in turning many fed-up Londoners into stool pigeons. Business and culture. Although only a small minority of people made up the population of medieval cities, they benefited well from the spending power of those countryside dwellers who travelled in to take advantages of the goods on offer. But they also brought in goods to sell to merchants such as butchers, millers and furriers. Without this flow of fresh goods such as meat and milk, neither manufacturer nor retailer would have been able to make a living. The hierarchy of cities was different from that in rural areas. At the top of the social scale were the landlords, who usually held important governmental positions, followed by the merchants and lawyers. Then came the artisans and traders, with the unskilled workers and labourers at the bottom of the pile. Just as today, medieval cities had a mixture of residential and commercial buildings. Many craftsmen lived with their family upstairs above the workshops. In medieval cities today, we can see the legacy of their occupation with street names such as Pie Corner, Beef Lane, Apothecary Street and Fisher Row. Guilds were established for skilled artisans, which meant special privileges such as workmen's compensation, the right to trade at the market, and limiting the number of specific trades within a city. Parish churches and other religious houses were important in cities during an age when the Catholic Church dominated all aspects of medieval life. Probably the most impressive part of a medieval city was its cathedral. Some were hundreds of years in the making. York Minster, although founded in 627, wasn't finished until 1472. And while Cologne Cathedral was begun in 1248, it was the middle of the 16th century before work was fully completed. These buildings fueled their city's economies by employing stonemasons, glaziers, engineers, architects, and a multitude of craftsmen down through the centuries. Richard de Vries saw London as a den of iniquity, full of dangerous temptations with its taverns, gambling dens, and brothels. And there can be no doubt that most cities in the Middle Ages were similar in that they were dirty, overcrowded, expensive, and full of disease. But not long after de Vries maligned London, the cleric William Fitzstephen praised the city as, quote, "a place of thrilling spectacles, admirable devotion, and exciting pastimes, including skating and football." Just like our cities of today for the medievals, they were essential hubs for spiritual, economic, political, and cultural activities. Thank you for watching this episode of Medieval Madness. Please subscribe if you haven't, and I'll see you next week for another video. Cheers! For thousands of years, people have placed curses on their enemies and wished them misfortune. Many of these hexes have involved pleas to the forces of the occult with prayers and rituals. Sometimes it might be an actual object or a place that is cursed, like a tomb. Many medieval tales involve warnings about destruction and deaths that appear to be linked to curses. Let's travel back in time to the Middle Ages and hear about some of these mysterious tales of a biological bomb, the downfall of a dynasty, and why a bank in Tokyo opened an account in the name of a samurai warrior who had been dead for 1,000 years. Welcome to Medieval Madness. King Casimir IV Jagiellon. Casimir was the Duke of Lithuania and the King of Poland during the 15th century. He was remembered as one of the greatest medieval kings. Politically active and successful, he led Poland to defeat the Teutonic Order, who were taking their lands during the 13 Years' War. He brought glory and greater status in Europe to Poland by adding Prussia to his territories. He even received the highest order of chivalry from Britain when he was awarded the English Order of the Garter. Casimir was 65 years old when he died on June 7, 1472, just at the time that Columbus was arriving in America. The funeral had to be held at Wawel Cathedral, Krakow, which was 190 miles south of Grodno Castle, where he had died. It was summer and the weather was hot, so this became a problem. Carried in a simple wooden casket and covered in expensive textiles, his naked body soon began to decay. He was protected with more textiles and resin and buried on July the 11th, almost a month after his death, and his coffin became a biological ticking time bomb that wreaked havoc 500 years later. Deadly serious. In 1973, researchers were permitted to open Casimir's red marble tomb as part of the cathedral's renovation and found 2 rotted wooden coffins containing the remains of the former king and his wife Elizabeth, who had been interred beside him in 1505. Initially, the work was undertaken by a group of 12 conservationists, and after restoration work was completed, Casimir and Elizabeth were reinterred in a ceremony in September of 1973. It was during the next few months that the Jagiellonian curse began to claim its victims. The first conservationist died prematurely in April 1974, followed by the second and third in June and August. By May 1975, another was dead, and either strokes or infections were being blamed. Over the next few years, no fewer than 15 people who had worked on or near the tomb were dead from either cancer or other diseases. Researchers finally made the connection. The killer was the saprophytic and pathogenic fungus called Aspergillus flavus, a fungus that is poisonous to mammals and causes infections. It is so toxic that it is used as an ingredient in pesticides. Spores are produced and can cause infections when inhaled, everything from suppression of the immune system to liver cancer and hepatitis. It's thought that the fungus began to develop in the tomb during medieval times and attacked everything around it when the grave was open. Researchers have since stated that anyone who has undergone recent cancer treatment or suffers from pulmonary disease should not visit any sites of Egyptian tombs, because Aspergillus flava has been found in several of them. Tour guides at Wawel Cathedral like to tell the story of Casimir IV, the king who cursed those who disturbed his final resting place. And many think that a fungus alone could not have caused so many deaths among the team of conservationists, believing instead that it was Casimir's curse all along. Jacques de Molay. The Knights Templars were a Catholic military order that existed for almost 200 years during the Middle Ages. The organization began around 1119 after the capture of Jerusalem by the Franks in the First Crusade to keep Christian pilgrims safe when they visited the Holy Land. The Templars were skilled warriors and developed an early form of banking which saw them amass a huge fortune, making them one of the most influential organizations in Europe. It was even rumoured that they had found King Solomon's lost treasure. Jacques de Molay became their Grand Master in 1292 after a lengthy campaign in the Middle East. After the fall of Acre, the Crusaders lost their last major stronghold in the Holy Land. Molay tried to gather support for a new attack, and there were rumours of a merging of the Knights Templars and the Knights Hospitallers to achieve this, but both Grand Masters opposed this despite pressure from the Pope. King Philippe IV of France was heavily in debt to the Templars and had no intentions of ever paying the money back. He wanted to merge all of the Christian fighting orders under his command, making himself a war king. In 1307, Philippe and the French Pope Clement V conspired together to bring down the Templar Order. Molay, who was now in his 60s, was arrested and charged with heresy on Friday the 13th of October. After torture and a forced confession, Molay admitted to the trumped-up offences and was sentenced to death. The Templar Order was disbanded and all of their possessions were confiscated and added to the royal treasury. A dead dynasty. After several years in prison, Molay was slowly burned to death in March of 1314 on a small island in the Seine in Paris. Before dying, Molay cursed both the Pope and Philippe IV, saying that, quote, "Within a year and a day you would be obliged to answer for your crimes in God's presence." Pope Clement died just a month later in April 1314 after a long illness. While his body was lying in state, lightning struck the church, setting it alight. The intensity of the fire was so great that by the time it could be extinguished, Clement's body was almost destroyed. As for Philippe, he lasted a few months more until November, when he died because of a stroke that he had whilst out hunting. His son Louis X was next to rule, but he died less than 2 years into his reign at the age of just 26. His son John I was born after his death, but only lived for 5 days. Louis's brother Philippe V came next, but he died of multiple illnesses when he was 28 after just over 5 years of rule. His brother Charles IV then died with just 6 years on the throne. Like his brothers before him, Charles had no surviving sons. In just 14 years after Malay's death, the 300-year-old house of Capet had collapsed, and his curse seemed to have come to pass. Taira no Masakado. Masakado was a magnate and a samurai from eastern Japan. The date of his birth is unknown, but it's thought to be around the beginning of the 10th century. He was a warrior and a rebel who led the first uprising against the government. At that time, Tokyo was little more than a village, and Japan was ruled from over 260 miles away in Kyoto. The borderland of Tokyo was a lawless place full of warlords called the samurai, men who bragged of their loyalty to the throne and whose name means those who serve. Masakado announced one day that the sun goddess had chosen him to be the new emperor. He was the first person to lead an uprising against the central government. He conquered 2 northern provinces and killed a local governor. The real emperor was enraged by his treachery, and the government put a bounty on Masakado's head. And so the legends began. He was said to be invincible except for a spot on the top of his head. It was said that his mother was a serpent and she had not licked him there. Swarms of butterflies and the arrival of rainbows in the capital had foretold of the rebellion. 2 months later, it turned out that Masakado wasn't invulnerable, and he was killed at the hand of his cousin at the Battle of Kojima in 940. The government tried to claim that Masakado had been stabbed by swordleaf trees in the afterlife and that his liver was being roasted for all eternity, but the damage was done, and this sort of propaganda made the authorities look weak and scared. Takayashi, his daughter, was rumoured to live inside his ruined fortress and was using the occult to help her father return from the dead and seek his revenge. So the government had Masakado's head cut off, and it was taken to the capital of Kyoto to be hanged from a tree. But the head supposedly just howled all night, wanting to know where its body was. In the end, the head took flight and landed in the fishing village of Shibazaki. There the residents washed it and respectfully buried it, carving charms on the gravestone so that the head would not escape. Strangely, the grave was often struck by lightning, and bizarre apparitions were seen, and any bad luck visited on the village was blamed on Masakado. A deadly legacy. In the meantime, the rebellious samurai boys, spurred on by Masakado's infamy, continued to seize power for themselves. Masakado was named the first samurai, and his grave, which was at the Kanda Buddhist shrine, was now located at the new capital city of the shogun called Edo. The shogun were the military dictators of Japan who ruled until the late 19th century. In 1868, a revolution overthrew Masakado's people, the shogun were usurped, and the emperor was restored. Edo was renamed Tokyo, and Masakado's grave ended up laying on the grounds of the new finance ministry. Masakado was denounced as an enemy of the emperor to finally put an end to his legendary status. But then the trouble started at the ministry. It burned down during an earthquake in 1923. The new building which replaced it was also said to be cursed too. There were many falls and accidents which claimed the lives of 14 people over a period of just 5 years. This included the death of the finance minister himself. It came to light that during construction work, Masakado's grave had been damaged. So in 1928, after the restoration of the tomb, it was exorcised by a priest. But the carved stone slab that was engraved with spells to pacify Masakado and keep him inside was not replaced properly. In 1940, 9 offices near the site of the grave were struck by lightning and destroyed. The slab was replaced, but a bulldozer tipped over and the driver was killed. Then in the 1990s, the Mitsui Finance Corporation decided to sell mining rights to the area, but went bankrupt in 2002. What followed was the extraordinary idea by a branch of the Tokyo Mitsubishi Bank to soothe the fallen samurai. The bank overlooked the lot that contained Masakado's burial place. They opened a bank account in his name and made sure that no employees ever turned their backs on Masakado or opened any windows that faced his grave. Taira no Masakado, a rebellious samurai whose curse has reached down over 1,000 years and terrorized a city. Thank you for watching this episode of Medieval Madness. Please do subscribe if you enjoy these videos, as it really helps us out, and we'll see you next week for another one. Cheers! It was a spectacular win for the young English King Henry V on St. Crispin's Day 1415, and everybody loves to see a win for the underdog, a victory for the common soldier over the well-armed knight. It felt like every moment of the 100 Years' War had been leading up to this point, a pivotal battle that would change the course of European warfare forever and saw the French army lose to an English army that was less than half its size. But war is, and was, a dangerous and violent affair. So today we continue our Day in the Life series and travel back in time whilst I impersonate what we think life would have been like for one of Henry V's soldiers at the Battle of Agincourt. Welcome to Medieval Madness. The Siege of Harfleur. King Henry was just 27 years old in the late summer of 1415. He was determined to reclaim the French lands that had been fought over and passed between England and France for almost 80 years, declaring that, quote, "We, with God's help, are about to go overseas to recover and regain the inheritances and just rights of our crown, which, as everyone agrees, have long been unjustly withheld." Still holding on to Calais and Bordeaux and wanting to establish a firm base, Henry chose to land at the port of Harfleur. On August the 14th, 10,000 of us landed there, 8,000 archers and 2,000 men-at-arms. The men were mostly from the middle and the south of England, but some of us were from further north and South Wales. I was from Cheshire, which is much further north. It was quite late in the year to be starting a campaign, but we all had trust in God and King Harry. The crossing took us 2 days, and we landed on the beach of Harfleur, where we stayed for almost a month and camped nearby. We were told to stuff the town full of Englishmen so that Normandy would be subdued and the English Channel would be protected. But it wasn't as easy as it seemed, and Harfleur was heavily fortified. After just a few days, the bloody flux began among the men. The smell of human excrement and vomit around the camp was eye-watering, and I too suffered badly from stomach cramps, sweating and diarrhea, but I wasn't as ill as some. Over 1,000 men had to be shipped back home, and still thousands more died. This meant that we had lost at least a third of our troops. Whilst death and disease were all around us, we bombarded the walls of Harfleur with our heavy guns until at last, after many negotiations, the town surrendered and the gates were opened to us on September the 22nd. It was too late now to march south to Paris and on to Bordeaux, so King Harry, after holding a council of war at the beginning of October, decided that we would march through Normandy to the safety of Calais. The idea was that we were showing the gathering French army that we were not afraid of engaging with them, when actually they would never be able to catch us before we reached our safe haven. The march. Calais was 120 miles north, which meant that we needed to cross over several rivers en route. Our numbers being so badly depleted meant that we now had only around 5,000 archers and 900 men-at-arms as the march began. It took us 5 days to cover 80 miles, but we were about to cross the River Somme on October the 8th, when the scouts came riding back in with news for the king, and whispers were soon running through the men that the French enemy was almost upon us. Now we would have to walk further to find a way across. The French followed us closely, frustrating our every move. We were already exhausted, having marched 260 miles in just 2.5 weeks. Not only was the bloody flux back, but there was a shortage of bread, and we were beginning to starve. Yet still, the French would not engage us. Blocking our way to the safety of Calais and stalling while they waited for more troops to arrive, King Harry decided that we had no other choice than to turn and fight. We sheltered for the night around the villages of Maisfoncel, and although there was little food and my belly ached from hunger, there was plenty of ale and we drank well. Cry God for Harry, England and St. George. By the time the sun rose on the 25th of October, both armies were in position, and there we stood, motionless throughout the cold and wet morning, waiting. Then word went through the ranks that King Henry had decided to advance. There were many priests with us, and communion was taken before the battle commenced. Then Henry appeared before us, his helmet encircled with a golden crown that was studded with jewels. His white harness had been polished to an almost blinding glare. Then he delivered a speech to us, proclaiming, "In the name of Almighty God and of St. George, forward banner, and St. George this day thine help." We knew that he would be risking his life there on the field with us, in the thick of battle. Along with my fellow archers, I knelt and made the sign of the cross. Then we all picked up a handful of dirt from the ground and placed it into our mouths, as a symbol of the death and burial that we would accept if God should will it. The size of the French army was breathtaking. There looked to be at least twice as many men as we had, and they seemed as if they were an innumerable multitude of locusts. Every one of us archers had been carrying a pointed stake around for the last week. We drove the 6-foot stakes deep into the ground at the front of the battlefield to halt the charging horses, sloping them towards the enemy higher than a man's waist above the ground. There was a rumour that King Henry had been warned by a French prisoner that a mass of cavalry was to advance on our English archers. In the thick of it, we slowly trudged forward through the strength-sucking mud until we were within longbow range. Spread out across the field, the men disappeared into the forest that stood on either side. It was astonishing to see that the French were still unmoving, about 800 feet away across the sodden field. We archers were under the command of Sir Thomas Erpingham, a brave veteran who was undoubtedly one of the most experienced soldiers present. Sir Thomas begged for us to fight vigorously and do well in Henry's name. Then he commanded us to strike before he dismounted and joined the king, who was also on foot among his men. I notched an arrow to my strings and lifted my bow before letting go. 5,000 arrows soared high above, darkening the sky before falling onto the French. There were screams of surprise and pain before the cavalry charged at us, but their horses struggled to reach any great speed over the sticky, slippery ground, and I had loosed at least 17 arrows by the time they reached us. Many horses were shot and collapsed in the mud, throwing their riders off. Those that were able to reach us tried to force their way through, and their horses became impaled on the stakes. Those who crossed the lines were quickly pulled from their mounts and attacked in a rage of stabbing, battering, and stomping. Then came the men-at-arms with their best fighters at the front. But the fleeing horses caused chaos and vanguard broke formation. We continued to shoot as we ran out in front of the French, firing even more arrows at close range, before running back to safety and turning to fire another volley. We were so close to the Frenchmen, I could have sworn our arrows pierced breastplates and helmets. Many collapsed and were trampled as they fell forward face first and drowned in their helmets in the heavy mud. Agincourt. Looking for King Henry, the French funneled themselves towards the middle of the field, climbing over the bodies of their fallen. Their vanguard of about 5,000 men found itself so tightly packed that those who were in the third rank could scarcely use their swords. Heavily armoured, they marched through the middle of the mud where they sank up to their knees. Conveniently, they were already overcome with fatigue before they reached us. We kept on firing. The bodies piled higher and higher until the living fell upon the dead, and even those falling upon the living were killed. In fact, the heap of those who had been killed and those who lay crushed between them grew so great that our men climbed the piles which had grown higher than a man's height, and slaughtered them at the rear with their swords, axes, and other weapons. When at last, after 2 or 3 hours, their vanguard had been transfixed and broken up, and the remainder were forced into flight, our men began to disperse those heaps and to separate the living from the dead, intending to keep them to serve as slaves. Eventually, with the French leaders either killed or captured, it was finally over. Thousands were dead or taken prisoner. We carried away our injured, while several of the French, half dead and wounded, crawled away into an adjoining wood or to some villages as well as they could, where many expired. The killing of the prisoners. In an unusual set of circumstances, the defeated men now outnumbered the victors, and there was fear that the French rearguard was a comparable number, still fresh and attempting to regroup. So Henry ordered us to massacre several thousand French prisoners. Only those highly ranked who could bring a good ransom were to be spared. So we went onto the field through the masses, mounds, and piles of men, and searched with our knives and swords to kill any still left alive. For those already wounded and dying, it was a mercy. And after a short while, the enemy ranks abandoned to us a field of blood. We had obtained victory, and the rigours of war had finished. I can only thank God that, like good King Harry, I too had survived. The myth. It is thought that there were only about 600 Englishmen lost at the Battle of Agincourt, compared to 6,000 of the French, who were mostly nobles. In addition, between 700 to over 2,200 Frenchmen were captured. The victory was seen as a blessing from God, and on his return to England, King Henry V was said to have been carried ashore on the shoulders of his triumphant citizens. Parades were held in London that proclaimed, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." In Europe, Henry's reputation was changed overnight. In Italy, he became known as Il Magnifico. He was lauded as our victorious King of England, Henry V, faithful soldier of Christ and strongest striver after peace, by English envoys at the Church Council of Constance. In 1416, Sigismund, Emperor of Germany, visited Henry and became his ally. His myth was cemented by Shakespeare's play, which established Henry as the conquering hero, honourable and ruthless in equal measure. On his return to France to pursue his rights and privileges, Henry succeeded in his conquest of Normandy, which led to the Treaty of Troyes in 1420 and acclaimed him as heir to the French throne. At the Battle of Mons during World War I in 1914, a journalist wrote a story that saw the ghosts of Agincourt longbowmen appear as angels in the sky to aid the British soldiers. Just as the medieval chronicles speak of St. George, who arrived to fight beside the men in Henry's army. Thank you for watching this episode of Medieval Madness. It was a bit of a different format to usual, so let us know down in the comments below if you want to see more of these types of videos, and I'll see you next week for another one. Cheers! Most people know what it means when someone is described as a con man. It's short for confidence man, what we would know today as a scammer. People who use deceit, cleverness, and lies for their own ends. The scam is usually about greed and is a way of defrauding someone to get their money. Although we associate scams today with phones and modern technology, they've been around for hundreds of years. Let's travel back in time to the Middle Ages and hear about some of those swindlers. There we will meet a fake cursed prince, dodgy government inspectors, and some dodgy bakers. Welcome to Medieval Madness. Bad bakers. It's a well-known fact that the medievals ate lots and lots of bread, so bakers needed to bake lots of bread to keep their customers happy. During the 13th century in medieval England, laws were brought in to regulate the weight, price, and quality of bread and beer. The size of bread and ale was in fact the first law to control British food in both production and sales, meaning that there would be fines and even punishments for any wrongdoers. It was necessary for everyone to be able to afford to buy bread, and because the price had to be kept constant, the weight of a loaf would be adjusted. When the price of grain rose, the weight of bread had to be reduced. This meant that many unscrupulous bakers would try to con their customers by adding things to make their bread weigh more. Sometimes they would add things like chalk or even dirt. In one case in 1388, a baker in London by the name of John Gibb went even further by adding iron to his bread. Some bakers would even go so far as to move out of the city and then send in their servants to deliver the batches so they could avoid getting caught. One official was recorded as saying that, quote, "These fraudulent bakers who carry on their business secretly are hiding themselves like foxes." In 1327, a baker named John Bird came up with a clever scam. At his shop, like many others in the city, people were able to come and make their own bread. They would bring their own dough and it would be put on a moulding board for preparation. Because the medievals were super sanitary folk, there would have been a small trap set into the moulding board for catching mice and rats. Underneath the table was a little area, a small set of doors would be opened and the mouse would fall in. In John's shop though, one of his servants would be secretly hiding beneath the table in this little space and pinching small amounts of dough through the trap doors. Little by little, these pieces of dough would add up. But John's servant was caught hiding with quite a large amount of dough, so the alderman and the mayor decided to launch an investigation. It was found that there were 9 more bakers, including 2 women in the city of London, who were carrying out that type of fraud. The dough pinchers were all jailed and sent to trial. All of their moulding boards were destroyed, and the criminals were taken to the pillory where they had the dough hung around their necks and were publicly humiliated and left to the mercy of the crowds for the day. They were warned that if they were caught carrying out the offense for a second time, then they would be exiled from the city. Absolutely potty. Other scammers were working in London too. It was easier in such a big city with a large population. In smaller towns, you were less likely to get away with defrauding the people when everybody knew everyone else. In those places, confidence tricksters were more likely to be strangers from outside of the area. In 1316, a man named Alan Lesopper was selling what appeared to be brass pots in the city. Actually, the pots were made from substandard metals, and Alan was putting them in the fire and working on them so that they looked like they were made of brass. Anyone who bought one would take it home, and after putting it on the fire to use, would find themselves with a melted and useless piece of rubbish. Other people, like taverners, would add colouring to bad wine to make it seem good, and mix sour wine with good wine to disguise the taste. Merchants might even add dirt to spices such as cinnamon. Gone begging. In 1380, two men were begging on the London streets. Their names were Richard Linham and John Ward. The story that had been circulating was that the two men were traders, and they had been set upon by robbers who stole everything they had and cut out their tongues for good measure. The two beggars carried John's tongue around with them on a little hook, and for those who could read, there was a small note attached to it which read, quote, "This is the tongue of John Ward." Many people were illiterate, but just the fact that there was writing to accompany the tongue made it seem special. The men would open their mouths to make a roaring noise and show people that their tongues were missing. Somehow though, the city authorities realised that it was all a ruse. The men obviously had tongues because when they were arrested and questioned, they confessed. They spent 3 full days in the pillory and were also jailed afterwards. In the Middle Ages, false beggars were regarded with contempt. It was generally accepted that begging was the only way for some vulnerable people to survive. By pretending, these two men were taking advantage of that fact and were dealt with accordingly. Sham Shandy Scammers. There are many other tales about people pretending to be someone or something they're not. Of course, with no internet or IDs, it was difficult to tell if someone was telling the truth about their identity. Most people would probably be quite trusting, and if someone was clever enough, they could take advantage of that fact. Like the man who pretended to be a sergeant of the Sheriff of London and went around fining bakers, or the one who said he was one of the mayor's officers. He went around the taverns checking that regulations were being followed. In some cases, the guidelines were being broken, so the false inspector took bribes of 6p or 12p to turn a blind eye when he wasn't even a real official. Another cheeky imposter declared himself the taker of the ale from the royal palace. He was caught going around to different inns and confiscating barrels of beer, saying that, quote, "This ale is needed by the king and I am taking it with me. You'll be paid for it later." One swindler even passed himself off as an earl. He said he had fled to London because the king wanted him to marry one of the queen's handmaidens and he didn't want to. He got people to hide him and look after him in their houses. One merchant allowed him to stay at his home and sleep with his daughter because the fake earl said that she was more beautiful than the queen's handmaiden and he wanted to marry her instead. Some even went so far as to claim they were actual kings, like Perkin Warbeck, who pretended to be one of the princes of the Tower, or Giano de Guccio from Siena, Italy, who claimed to be King John I of France and Navarre. The real John had died at just 5 days old and was the youngest person ever to be King of France. Rumours began to circulate that he was alive, and Giano claimed that he was the rightful heir to the throne. Aping around. It was a Friday in the year 613 in the city of Haran, southeast Turkey. Because it was a Friday and the Islamic day of congregational prayer, all of the mosques in the city were full of faithful worshippers. They were performing their ritual ablutions and rolling out their prayer mats. But one of the congregation didn't quite fit in. He was actually an ape. He was dressed like a man, in fact he wore opulent clothing and was perfumed like a royal prince. The saddle on the mule that he rode was made from finely decorated gold. He was escorted by Indian slaves who carried his shoes and prayer mat. On entering the mosque, the ape performed the customary prayer of salutation before using his prayer beads in his personal contemplation. The other worshippers watched on in astonishment, and as the crowd of onlookers grew, the ape's servants began to spread a story around the mosque. He wasn't really an ape, they said. He was actually an important prince, and he came from one of the richest Indian kingdoms. His wife grew jealous of his handsome good looks and his piety, and had him turned into a beast with a curse. As the story unfolded, the ape pressed a handkerchief to his eyes and began to weep. His faithful slaves told how his wife was holding the prince's life to ransom and had sworn not to end the curse until she received a substantial amount of gold. It was certainly fortunate then that the kings of India had almost gathered together the large amount, although they needed just that little bit more. Wouldn't it be wonderful if the people of Haran could offer some of their money to help the virtuous prince on such a holy day in return for Allah's blessings? The con worked, and the princely ape and his devoted followers made off with a small fortune. But they weren't taken in by a fellow traveller to Haran, a man named Al-Jabari who had seen through the sob story of the poor cursed prince, who was really just a well-trained ape. This tale was later recounted in a book written by Al-Jabari, now known as the Book of the Charlatans. It was said to have been written at the request of Rukn al-Din, a Turkoman ruler. In it, Al-Jabari, who was a scholar and an explorer from Damascus, Syria, exposed the fraudulence he had seen practiced by alchemists and money changers. He actually described alchemists as, quote, knowing 300 ways of making dupes, and mocks them, saying that anyone who knew how to actually turn base metal into gold would never tell such a profitable secret to anyone anyway. Al-Jabari seemed to be well acquainted with many different areas of knowledge, including medicine, astrology, and geomancy, which was obvious from his exacting descriptions of formulas and illusions. The book is highly enjoyable, with tales of lusty highwaymen and fake holy men who pretended that they have halos by filling hairnets with glowworms. Men who try to pass themselves off as healers by covering their helpers in a mix of ingredients including mandrake leeks and green vitriol, and then bathing them in hot water to make it seem as though they have been cured. There are instructions on how to forge an ancient treasure map, make a severed head speak, or manufacture fake spices and jewels. Now, nobody would want to be the victim of a con, but it's fun to hear that there have been conmen around for hundreds of years, and we can only imagine that we would never be so stupid as to be tricked so easily. Let me know in the comments whether you think that's the case or not. Thank you for watching this video, and I'll see you next week for another one. Have a great week. Cheers! Worship of the saints was a central belief of the medieval church, but not all saints had equal importance. The appeal of some was universal, and they were revered right across Christendom. Usually established very early on, they were often figures from the Bible, such as St. John the Baptist or St. Paul, who were martyred during Roman rule. But at the opposite end of the scale, there were also the little-known saints connected to local cults. Let's travel back in time and take a look at some saint worshippers who were at odds with one another, the martyred and murdered children, and the strange relics that were all part of the medieval cult of saints. Welcome to Medieval Madness. Saint was. Henry of Lagenstein was a 14th century philosopher and theologian. He tried to explain a community's intense adoration of a particular saint when he was writing a sermon. He explained that, quote, "The saints of God are entrusted with the spiritual care of power over peoples, regions, and cities, where they happily lived and were buried, and where they left relics, where through the consecration of churches in their honor, they have been received as patrons. So when any race, city, and country is placed under the rule of these leaders, every race venerates its saintly men and women as its own gods and goddesses with enhanced solemnity, prays for them with great devotion, and fears their anger and resentment more." Strangely, saint cults not only brought communities together, but they could also cause conflict, akin to modern-day football teams. Saint Aldebert. This was one of the most important cults in Central Europe during the Middle Ages. A monk in Rome and a bishop in Prague, Aldebert died as a martyr in Prussia amongst the pagans. He lived in the second half of the 10th century and led such an adventurous and well-travelled life that his cult was widespread. Preaching his Christian message in the port of Trousseau, Aldebert was set upon by a pagan mob, killed and then decapitated. His head was mounted and displayed on a pole for all to see. It was Boleslaw the Brave, Duke of Poland, that bought Aldebert's body for its weight in gold and returned it to Poland after that final Christian mission to Prussia had gone so badly wrong. Aldebert was buried at Gniezno and his cult began. However, Otto III, Holy Roman Emperor, had known Aldebert personally, so in the year 1000, accompanied by Pope Sylvester II, not only went to pay his respect to Aldebert's relics, but also wanted to take some of them away with him. Boleslaw was of course rewarded with titles and gifts in exchange for Aldebert's right arm. Then the Bohemians laid their claim to St. Aldebert's cult. In 1039, Duke Bretislav of Bohemia had pilfered Aldebert's bones and taken the relics to Prague to join St. Vitus and St. Wenceslas there. And a biography had appeared that mentioned Aldebert's missionary work in Hungary. So King Stephen I also staked his claim on Aldebert's patronage. Meanwhile, the Polish cult still continued. It was said that Bratislav had stolen the wrong bones because Aldebert's were hidden somewhere in Gniezno. Then in 1127, St. Aldebard's decapitated head, which had not been purchased by Boleslaw during the original body-buying deal, was found and returned to Poland. All this vying of ownership of Aldebard's relics inspired the rise of a rival Polish cult. This man was another martyred bishop, but one killed by a tyrant rather than pagans, Saint Stanislaw. It was 250 years after the canonization of Aldebard that Stanislaw was recognized as a saint. Stanislaw was said to have raised a man from the dead. When he was killed by King Boleslaw II in 1079, his body was cut into pieces, but miraculously regenerated. An event that came to symbolize the unification of Poland. Eventually, Stanislaw won the War of the Two Bishop Saints, becoming the more dominant, although both men are recognized as Polish patron saints today. Little-known cults. There were 3 women who were particularly important to the people of Peterborough in England and the surrounding fenlands during the Middle Ages. Kienberger, Kienswide and Tiber were venerated there in their home region because of their connection to Peterborough Abbey, but were probably unknown outside of this area. All 3 women were members of the royal Mercian family. Kienberger and Kienswitha, being King Penda of Mercia's daughters, were princesses, and Tiber is thought to have been his niece. Penda followed the path of Anglo-Saxon paganism. At that time, England was divided up into several kingdoms. Around the year 653, the Kingdom of Northumbria was ruled by a Christian king who made peace with Mercia. Marriages were arranged linking the children of each of the 2 kings. Kienberger and Kienwitha converted to Christianity, and it was agreed that a monastery or abbey should be built and dedicated to St. Peter, Paul and Andrew. A monastery which housed both monks and nuns was built at the village of Castor in what was once the Soak of Peterborough. Kienberger became the first abbess there and was later joined by her sister Kienswitha, who also became abbess and was succeeded by Tiber. The 3 became esteemed as saints, and evidence of their worship can be seen in calendars and liturgical writings containing instructions on how to celebrate their feast days. Although the relics of the 3 women were lost during the Reformation, a chapel dedicated to all 3 7th century saints can still be visited at Peterborough Cathedral. Outside of the area of Peterborough, there is very little evidence of any interest in the 3 women. Child saints. Another example of a purely local cult were the followers of the child saint Solange. During the Middle Ages, dead children were recognized by the Catholic Church as holy martyrs. The massacre of the innocents, as retold in the Gospel of Matthew, described how King Herod of Judea ordered the slaughter of all male children aged 2 years and under in the land. This was to make sure that the baby Jesus was eradicated. From this story, the cult of the Holy Innocents began to spread all over Europe. And although there was no historical evidence that the massacre ever actually happened, relics from the infant victims began to appear. In 1465, Canterbury Cathedral boasted the lips of one of the Holy Innocents amongst their collection of relics. Going into the later Middle Ages, this led to veneration of other young saints such as Solange. She was a shepherdess who lived and died in the 9th century and is venerated as a Catholic saint and a cephalophore. This word originates from the Greek for head carrier and describes a saint who is usually seen holding their own severed head. This was meant to show that they had been martyred by decapitation. In Western art, this caused a dilemma for the artist when deciding where to put the halo. Should it be where the head used to be, or should it be above the head that the saint was carrying? Above the left foot? The right elbow? Personally, I think it sits nicely by the left funny bone. Many legends describe a saint standing up, picking up their own head and carrying it after they had been beheaded. Solange. Solange was born into poverty in the town of Litmont near Bourges, the capital of Cher province in France. The daughter of devout Christians, Solange had her virginity consecrated at age 7 during a liturgical rite carried out by a bishop. This meant that she would spend her life as a bride of Christ and a virgin, and later join a nunnery or serve the church in some other way. It was said that Solange's mere presence would cause the sick to be cured and devils to be exorcised. The Count of the city of Poitiers had a son who became obsessed with Solange's beauty and popularity. He went to speak with her while she was tending the sheep, but she rebuffed him and an argument broke out. Unable to accept Solange's rejection, he decided to abduct her. He went and took her out one night by force. As they were crossing over a stream, Solange struggled to free herself and fell from the horse. Her kidnapper became so incensed that he beheaded her with his sword. Miraculously, apparently her severed head prayed to the holy name of Jesus 3 times. Then she stood up, picked up her own head, and carrying it, she walked to the church of St. Martin before she finally lay down and died there. A local cult surrounding Solange immediately sprang up. Miraculous cures began to be recognized as being due to her intervention. In 1281, the Church of St. Martin erected an altar in her honor and began to refer to itself as the Church of St. Solange. The nearby field where she had prayed became the Field of St. Solange. Even the village changed its name in veneration of its patron, and is the only commune in France to use her name, and her cult is restricted to that area. In times of great trauma and worry, the locals would form a great procession through the streets of Bourges, with the casket carrying Solange's head in front of them, in an appeal that she would protect them from drought. She is recognized as the patron saint of shepherds and rape victims. Saint Serafina. Another child saint that had a particularly strong cult following in her hometown was Fina dei Ciardi. Born in San Gimignano, Tuscany, Italy, Fina was sadly afflicted with a paralytic illness when she was just about 10 years old. In 1248, the disease took hold, leaving her seriously ill and paralyzed. During that time, both her father and her mother died. Despite her physical and mental suffering, Fina never complained about her anguish. In fact, it only strengthened her faith. She insisted on sleeping on a wooden pallet rather than a bed. She was visited frequently by the people of San Gimignano, who were encouraged by her devotion to God. Fina was drawn to Saint Gregory the Great and experienced a vision of him foretelling her own death. As predicted by Gregory, Fina died on March 12, 1253, after 5 years of pain and illness. She was just 15. After Fina's death, her cult began at once, when all of the bells of San Gimignano were said to have rung out on their own, and her corpse released the odour of sanctity. This term began in the Middle Ages and is recognized by the Catholic Church as a particular scent that emanates from the dead body of a saint, and is often described as being floral. White violets were also said to have bloomed on the wooden pallets of her bed once Fina's body was removed. Several miracles and visitations were reported after her death, including healing of the sick, and although she was never officially canonized, Fina is still venerated in San Gimignano, and the anniversary of her death is a recognized holiday and has been the tradition since 1481. Solange and Fina are just two of several venerated child saints who were worshipped in isolated areas by the medievals. The list also includes the infant named Rumwald of Buckingham, who only lived for 3 days, but was able to speak and profess his faith in God, request his own baptism, and even give a sermon before his premature demise. Saints were thought to be the perfect followers of Jesus and have existed since the Gospels were written, but it wasn't until the Middle Ages with its relics and pilgrimages that saint cults really reached their golden age. Then the faithful believed that the heavenly saints could intercede here on earth and help with everything from a toothache to the prevention of a war. Thank you for watching this episode. Please subscribe if you enjoyed these videos, and I'll see you next week for another one. Cheers! Throughout human history, one thing has remained constant, namely the enjoyment of having sex. But by the late Middle Ages, both gonorrhea and syphilis were widespread. Although the poor could only make do with superstition and herbal remedies, the rich could rely on their expensive physicians. Without antibiotics though, the success of any treatment was mostly based on luck. Especially when you consider that one popular medication for those who could afford it was mercury ointment, which we now know to be toxic and would end up fatally poisoning the patient anyway. In today's episode, we're going to look at pustules and the pox. Welcome to Medieval Madness. Epidemic. German physician and astrologer Joseph Grünpeck was born in the late 15th century. After contracting syphilis in his late 20s, he wrote, quote, "In recent times I have seen scourges, horrible sicknesses, and many infirmities afflict mankind from all corners of the earth. Amongst them has crept in, from the western shores of Gaul, a disease which is so cruel, so distressing, so appalling, that until now nothing so horrifying, nothing more terrible or disgusting has ever been known to the earth." At the end of the 1400s, Naples, Italy was besieged by the troops of King Charles VIII of France. This was during the First Italian War, caused by a dispute over the succession of the Neapolitan throne. It was at this time that syphilis became notorious across Europe. There were accounts told by the French soldiers of excruciating pain and physical disfigurement plaguing them as they marched their way home, spreading the disease as they went. Communications were sent in advance amongst panicking city officials and scholars as they tried to learn whatever they could about the disease before it reached their towns. What was known was that the affliction was as horrific as leprosy. What was not known was that it was spread through sexual contact. In Naples, it became known as the French disease. Early names for syphilis were usually based on racial slurs, each region seeing their neighbour as the original manufacturer of the disease. The chronicler Jean Molinet from Burgundy, France, wrote about, quote, "a very horrible leprosy and an abominable disease called pox. In 1496, the Great Pox. Others call it a Neapolitan disease." Syphilis spread rapidly across Europe. Perkin Warbeck, who was a pretender to the English throne, had the support of James IV of Scotland. Warbeck was joined by many mercenaries who were carriers of the sickness on his invasion into England. The annals of the Town Council of Edinburgh recognised it as, quote, "this contagious sickness call it the Grandor," a word from the Old French meaning great gore. By 1497, the disease had reached London, where, according to records from St. Bartholomew's Hospital, 10 out of every 20 patients were infected by what was known as the Great Pox. It wasn't until several decades after the start of the epidemic that the Italian physician and astronomer Girolamo Francesco named the disease syphilis. Columbus. And it's believed that syphilis was brought back to Spain from the New World by just a handful of sailors on Columbus's first voyage in 1492. It could have been the meeting of two different populations coming together and exchanging bacteria, which evolved into the STI that we know today. The timing could be right for this to be true, as the first written records of the disease began just 2 years later in Naples in 1494. Medieval myths. About 40 years after the death of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, the theologian Thomas Gascoigne wrote a biography of his death. In it he claimed that Gaunt, who was the father of King Henry IV of England, had died in bed, quote, "from putrefaction of his genitals and body caused by the frequenting of women, for he was a great fornicator." We have to bear in mind that Gascoigne was a great supporter of the Yorkist cause, and likely to be biased against the Lancastrians. Was he trying to insinuate that Gaunt was suffering from some sort of sexually transmitted disease? Since medieval medicine was all about balancing the humours and sex was viewed in terms of excretion, it was thought that a man could die from having too much sex. The belief was that that alone could kill him even if his partners were not carriers. The 13th century English knight and poet Walter of Bibsworth thought that although men were sexual predators, it was women who were the main culprits for immoral behaviour, and that illnesses such as smallpox and measles existed because of this. In fact, the symptoms of venereal disease and leprosy were very similar and often confused in medieval Europe. Lepers suffered because they had sinned, and part of that sin contained sexual offences. The disfigurement of their faces with pustules reflected the offender's constant state of lust. Leprosy was widespread throughout the 12th and 13th centuries. It is a horrific disease that attacks the nervous system, often causing the nose, fingers, and toes to erode. Not knowing what caused the disease meant that the medievals had to come up with their own theories. Any transgression against God was always believed to have consequences in the Middle Ages. A sexual act that was not done for the sole purpose of procreation was seen as immoral. So illness was not seen as being passed on through physical contact, but rather as a result of a transgression. The Prose Salinician Questions is a collection of manuscripts written around the year 1200 by an unknown Englishman. It describes how a woman might not contract leprosy even though she had intercourse with a sufferer, but her next lover would catch it instead. For the medievals, the susceptibility of women was the main problem. They were thought of as lewd and wanton and were blamed for the sexual thoughts of medieval men, as were the bawdy places that they inhabited, such as taverns and brothels. Women were considered to be the carriers of any unwanted infections, and medieval men blamed the entire gender of women when they contracted an STI, not just the individual. In the local bathhouses or stews of Southwark London, prostitutes with burning sickness, which was probably what we know today as gonorrhea, were sometimes banished by the local authorities. But the effectiveness of that as a preventative measure was probably pretty weak. Cures. Archbishop of Canterbury Thomas Becket is credited with a healing miracle involving the nobleman Obo de Beaumont. He became leprous straight after a visit to a brothel. Another man afflicted with what was thought to be leprosy immediately after calling on a sex worker was the Franciscan friar Arnoux de Valinol from Montelou, southern France. The whole experience frightened him so much that he turned to sodomy with young men instead for his sexual gratification. Beaumont was later tried in June of 1323 for his homosexual activities by Jacques Fournier, who later became Pope Benedict XII. The physician John of Goddesden wrote a treatise on medicine between 1305 and 1307 known as Rosa Anglica. In it he listed many diseases and injuries along with their remedies. He recommended that to keep the penis from harm, a man should always behave as though he knows that his partner is corrupted. As soon as the organ is withdrawn, it should be given a prolonged washing in either cold water or urine, and then wrapped in cloth soaked with vinegar, so as to purify it. If, as surprisingly often happened, the preventative measures did not work, then the patient would need to use one of the many remedies that were available for an itchy or swollen penis. The Trotula, a 12th century medical compendium, remarked that there were men, quote, who suffer swelling of the virile member, having there and under the prepuce many holes, and they suffer lesions. These men were advised to apply a poultice to the area to reduce the swelling, and then, quote, wash the ulcerous or wounded neck of the prepuce with warm water, and sprinkle on it powder of Greek pitch and dry rot of wood, or of worms and rose, and root of mullein, and bilberry. John Ardeen is regarded as England's first surgeon and the originator of some of the first workable cures in medicine. The 14th century physician is best known for specializing in treating knights in cases of fistula in anno, a common affliction caused by too much time in the saddle. His treatment for one of his cases where, quote, a man's yard began to swell after coit, due to the falling of his own sperm, whereof he suffered great grievousness of burning and aching, as men do when they are so hurt, was particularly brutal, and involved cutting the dead flesh away from the member with a razor, and then spreading on quicklime. Apparently though, this did result in a cure. Bleeding with leeches, or if all else failed, hitting the genitals with a heavy object, were also recommended as treatments. And if contracting a disease was seen as a punishment for the sin of sex, then maybe purity could be the cure. It was using this type of thinking that made having sex with a virgin another go-to remedy. Sadly though, many young maidens were raped in this way, and then having found themselves with an infection, were shunned by society for being an unclean sinner. Neither the Trotula nor John of Ardeen actually linked the symptoms experienced by their patients with an STI, even though there is an inference that the problems occurred after sex. It would seem that, as with the case of John of Gaunt, the cause of a postulating penis was thought to be due to overindulgence rather than some form of infection. It seems that Ardeen must have been doing something right though, because he lived to the ripe old age of 85, a rare occurrence in the Middle Ages. The first exacting description of syphilis came from a Venetian surgeon who had treated soldiers at the Battle of Fornovo in 1495. He noted that the disease first manifested with painless ulcers on the penis, followed by sores on the face and body, joint pain and itching. Surgeon to Pope Julius II, Giovanni da Vigo, also described the disease as having two stages: primary chancres on the genitalia, followed by secondary skin lesions. He noted that the severe joint pain occurred especially at night. Other symptoms included fever, sore throat, headache, blindness, mental decline, and ultimately death. Everyone agreed, both sufferers and healers, that the affliction had an alarming impact on the body. The military physician Alessandro Benedetti wrote that, quote, the entire body is so repulsive to look at, and the disease causes great suffering. Cesare Borgia, the illegitimate son of Pope Alexander VI, was so badly scarred with syphilitic facial lesions that he had to wear a black velvet mask that covered half of his face. From the evidence, we can assume that medieval men and women suffered from STDs long before syphilis started at the Siege of Naples. Going into the 16th century, medical practitioners worked hard to understand STIs, especially syphilis, and it was quickly acknowledged that it was spread through sexual intercourse. Thank you for watching this episode of Medieval Madness, and I'll see you next week for another one. Cheers! 15th century Florence was the epitome of a Renaissance city and home to some of the greatest philosophers, inventors and artists that have ever lived. A place full of new ideas, free thinking and beauty, and also home to two families with tremendous wealth and power, the Pazzis and the Medicis, as well as lots of other people with difficult to pronounce names. Please accept my apologies in advance. On Easter Sunday, the 26th of April 1478, a group of conspirators from the Pazzi family decided it would really like to destroy the Medici family and would start by murdering its two leaders, Guilanio and Lorenzo. Of all the places for this vicious attack to take place, it was the beautiful Florentine cathedral during High Mass that was chosen, and what followed was a bloodbath. Welcome to Medieval Madness. City-states. During the 1470s, Florence was a republic. At that time, there were several independent city-states in Italy, such as the Kingdom of Naples, ruled over by the influential and feared monarch King Ferrante. Then there were the Papal States, as the Pope was not just a religious figure as he is today, but he was also a ruler over what at times was a militant force that would seize territory whenever it saw fit. Because who would dare to argue with the official voice of God on Earth? Other independent kingdoms included Venice and Milan, ruled by Galeazzo Sforza, and smaller ones like Urbino that had to play clever diplomatic games to preserve their independence and not get pulled into the machinations. In the middle of all this political intrigue, a plot to assassinate the Medici and end their unofficial rule of Florence was being hatched. There were a couple of key players in Rome, which was the seat of papal power, namely Girolamo Riario, who was a courtesan there, and Francesco Salvatio Riario, another member of the noble Riario family, who would later become the Archbishop of Pisa, an appointment that the Medici family fiercely opposed. The Medici. The Medici family began to accumulate their wealth and influence when they prospered from the textile trade. In the 15th century, they had enough capital to create the Medici Bank, which became the largest bank in Europe and allowed them to rise politically. Through 3 successive generations, from Cosimo to Piero to Lorenzo, they dominated the Florentine government. There, they created a climate where Renaissance art and humanism were able to thrive. Although they were not a noble family, they went on to produce 2 French queens and 4 popes, later lending money to the papacy and becoming de facto rulers and then dukes of Florence. After all, it was the name of Lorenzo de' Medici, known as the Magnificent, that stood out above his relatives. Giuliano was his father's second son and became co-ruler of Florence with his older brother Lorenzo. The pair had the best education money could buy and took part in hawking and jousts. In appearance, Lorenzo was thought to be quite plain when compared to his younger sibling, who was the sporting and handsome golden boy. Like their grandfather and father before them, Lorenzo and Giuliano were at the centre of the community and controlled Florence by using proxies in the city council, men that had been bought off with bribes and arranged marriages. Of course, this caused resentment with other Florentine families, the most significant of these being the Pazzi, who were almost responsible for the premature end to Lorenzo's power. The conspiracy. In contrast to the Medici family, the Pazzi family were of noble descent with an illustrious past. During the First Crusade, their founder was said to have been the first man to storm the walls at the Siege of Jerusalem in 1099. In 1464, Jacopo became head of the Pazzi merchant banking family. And it was at Jacopo's villas with his nephews Francesco de' Pazzi, who managed the Pazzi Bank in Rome, Girolamo Riario, the Pope's protege, and Francesco Riario, the Archbishop of Pisa, as well as others, that the plot was hatched. The plan was to assassinate both Lorenzo and Giuliano and then take over the Florentine government. Together they went to Pope Sixtus to gain his support for the plot. Sixtus was quite sneaky with his backing though. Officially, he made a statement in which he claimed that he could never sanction the killing of another human being because of his holy office. Unofficially though, he made it perfectly clear that the papacy would benefit greatly if the Medici were eliminated from their powerful position in Florence. In fact, he went so far as to say that he would look favourably on anyone who got rid of them, telling the men to do what was necessary. Plan A was to poison the 2 eldest Medici brothers during a banquet on Saturday the 25th of April. This was to be held at the Medici's own villa, and it was to be Jacopo and Girolamo who would administer the fatal doses. But one of the conspirators suddenly became ill, so the idea was scrapped and the plotters moved on to Plan B, which would take place the following morning at Mass. The Pope. Unlike the men of the Pazzi family, Francesco della Rovere was not born into wealth. As a young man, he joined the Franciscans, where his intelligence soon shone through as he studied theology and philosophy at the University of Pavia. In 1464, he was elected general of the Franciscan order, and 3 years later, he became a cardinal. Then, on the unexpected death of Paul II of Francesco, he was elected pope in 1471 and given the name Sixtus IV. His character as a pious man was one of the deciding reasons for his appointment. However, his piety didn't stop him from being unduly biased towards the members of his own family. Determined to bolster his position, he began doling out both wealth and power to his nephews from the Rovere and Riario families. One of these nephews, Giovanni della Rovere, was made a Roman prefect even though he wasn't even a priest. Then, to bolster his influence even further, his uncle arranged for him to be married into the family of Dukes of Urbino. Giovanni's cousin Girolamo Riario, who it was rumoured was the Pope's son rather than his nephew, also lacked any theological learning but was still gifted in the town of Imola in Romagna. The idea was to form another papal state in that area, which lay right on the trade route between Venice and Florence. Lorenzo de' Medici had already made arrangements to buy the region from the Duke of Milan, Galeazzo Sforza, for 100,000 Florentine florins in May 1473. But the Duke sold it to Pope Sixtus instead for just 40,000 ducats, with a promise that Girolamo would marry his illegitimate daughter, Catherine Sforza. Ironically, the Duke expected this purchase to be financed by the Medici Bank. Unsurprisingly, Lorenzo refused the loan. Angry at this, Sixtus terminated the Medici family as the official bankers to the papal treasury, turning to other bankers for help. It was the Pazzi Bank that provided a considerable amount of the cost. Another cause of the conflict between Sixtus and Lorenzo revolved around the appointment of the Archbishop of Florence. After Pietro Riario died in 1474, leaving a vacancy for the job, Lorenzo was able to install his brother-in-law, Rinaldo Arinzi, to the position. But Francesco Salviati Riario wanted the post, and he was a friend of the Pazzi and a supporter of the Pope. The Hit. It was a Sunday morning on the 26th of April 1478 when the Medici family attended High Mass at the Duomo of Florence. Lorenzo and his co-ruler Giuliano were both there at the same time, which was unusual when they were attacked. Bernardo Bandini Baroncelli stabbed Giuliano in the chest. As he tried to escape, Francesco de' Pazzi jumped on him and began knifing him repeatedly with his dagger. Francesco became so frenzied in his attack that he managed to stab himself in the leg. With 19 stab wounds and a sword injury to the head, Giuliano bled out and died on the floor of the cathedral. Lorenzo, however, had been attacked by 2 of Jacopo de' Pazzi's men, and in drawing his sword he was able to defend himself. With help from family and friends, he was able to retreat to the sacristy with just a small neck wound. Once there, the heavy doors were barred against the assassins, and later Lorenzo escaped to his home at the Medici Palace, where he was informed of his brother's death. The aftermath. Taking some of Jacopo Pazzi's men with him, Francesco Salviati Riario went to the Palazzo della Signoria in front of the Florentine town hall in an attempt to seize control, but the coup was not a success. The people of Florence did not rise up against the Medici as the Pazzi had hoped. Despite the pleas of Lorenzo for the people not to rush to judgment, more than 30 people were attacked and killed that day. Some were part of the conspiracy, others only caught up in the crossfire. Salviati Riario was taken captive along with Francesco de' Pazzi, and they were hanged from the windows of Palazzo della Signoria. Between the 26th of April, being the day of the attack, and the middle of October, a total of 80 people were systemically hunted down and executed for playing a part in the plot. Lorenzo was able to save the life of Cardinal Raphael Riario, who, although another of the Pope's nephews, was probably an innocent in the matter, as well as 2 other Pazzi relations. Baroncelli was able to flee to Constantinople, but the Sultan Mehmed II had him arrested, and he was sent back to Florence, still in his Turkish attire. There in 1479 he was hanged from the window of Palazzo del Bargello for all to see. Jacopo escaped Florence and hid out in a village named Castagno, but he was recognized and sent back to the city. There he was tortured and hanged next to his nephew Francesco, who by that point must have been decomposing nicely. After being taken down and buried at the Santa Croce Church, Jacopo was dug up and dragged through the city before being propped up against the door at the Palazzo Pazzi. There his decaying head was used as a door knocker before being thrown into the River Arno. It was eventually fished out by some children and hung on a willow tree. After being further battered and humiliated, it was thrown back into the river. The Pazzis found themselves banished from the city of Florence, and all of their property was confiscated. Their family name and coat of arms were permanently censored by order of the Florentine government. Every Pazzi had to adopt a new name. Even Guglielmo de' Pazzi, who had married Lorenzo's own sister Bianca in 1460, was placed under house arrest. He was later banished from Florence. Eventually though, the 6th of their 16 children, Cosimo, became the Archbishop of Florence in 1508. By 1488, Girolamo Riario appeared to be the only conspirator left alive. But the man who had managed to escape the carnage that followed the attack on the 2 Medici brothers was himself about to become the victim of a conspiracy. Now the Count of Forli, a title gifted to him from his uncle Pope Sixtus, Girolamo was murdered by 9 assassins and slashed to death because of a financial dispute. An outcome that Lorenzo de' Medici must surely have approved of. Thank you for watching this episode. I'll see you next week for another one. Cheers! Animals were everywhere in medieval life. They were used to pull carts and plough fields, they were milked, sheared, skinned, and eaten. But were they ever kept just for the sake of companionship? Like my little dog Pepsi here, she's 16 years old, she's a Springer Cocker Spaniel, they're called Sprockers, she's amazing, I love her so goddamn much. The word pet as describing a sort of companion animal wasn't even used in the English language until the 16th century, and even then only in the north of England and Scotland. The Oxford English Dictionary definition states that a pet is, quote, an animal, a bird, etc., that you have at home for pleasure, rather than one that is kept for work or food. Well, for the medievals, this wasn't always the case, as many families who lived in the countryside would have had a byre attached to their living area, which they shared with goats and cattle. Dogs used for hunting would often live indoors, as did cats whose job was to catch mice. It seems that for the early medievals, real pets as we think of them today were a rarity. It's probably because they haven't met Pepsi. Welcome to Medieval Madness. Dogs. Albertus Magnus was a 13th century Dominican friar, scientist, and philosopher. Among his writings is a natural history book on animals that details their care. He recommended that dogs should not be allowed to eat straight from the dinner plate or be constantly petted if the aim was to have a reliable guard dog. Otherwise, he said, the animal would, quote, keep one eye on the door and one on the generous hand of the master. Most dogs were workers, many of them protecting homes, goods or livestock, and were found in all types of households, both rich and poor. Among the nobility, hunting dogs were highly prized. Known as running hounds, they hunted using scent and varied in breeds from small Italian greyhounds to Irish wolfhounds. Gaston III, Comte de Foix, wrote a book in the 14th century called the Livre de Chasse, which became the standard text on medieval hunting techniques. In it, he describes how to take care of the greyhounds, saying that they should be kept in kennels built from wood that were at least a foot above the ground. The kennel should have a loft so the dog will be warm in winter and cool in summer. The kennel should be cleaned every day and lined with fresh straw. As well as keeping their kennels clean, servants needed to give the dogs fresh water twice a day, take them out for regular walks, and allow them to play, quote, in a fair meadow in the sun. The hounds were fed better than most of the peasantry, being given bran bread and meat from the hunt. When they were sick, they would be given buttered eggs, goat's milk, chopped meat, and bean broth. Gaston explained that a master should always be truthful when speaking to his dog because, quote, hounds understand me and do as I wish better than any other man can make them do. A greyhound, the favoured gift of princes, was the usual hero of the medieval dog story. So much so that many lords had an effigy of their favourite pet placed at their feet on their tombstones. Noble ladies are often depicted as having lapdogs in medieval illuminations. Usually the pet would be either held on a leash or shown sitting at the lady's feet. Their collars sometimes decorated with little bells. The Queen Mary Psalter from the 14th century depicts a lady with a dog in her lap. The Romance of the Grail shows another small dog wearing a collar that is patted by a lady who is speaking to Sir Lancelot. A man's best friend. Admired greatly for their intelligence and loyalty, people loved to hear stories about their canine companions. The Duke of Berry personally took time to go and see a dog that was known for guarding the grave of his dead owner, laying there day and night. The man had been killed by the English at the Battle of Chiswick in 1373. The Duke was so moved by the faithfulness of the animal that he gave a pension of 10 francs to a citizen who lived nearby, to make sure that the dog had a regular source of food until he died. A French book on household management called Les Managers de Paris was written in 1393 by an older Parisian merchant who wanted to tutor his younger wife. In it, the merchant tells the tale of Aubry de Montdidier, who was murdered in 1371 by an unknown assailant. After his death, his dog took a particular dislike to a man by the name of Macaire. So King Charles V of France ordered a trial by combat between the dog and Monsieur Macaire. The dog won, Macaire confessed, and was hanged. This tale also appears in the Livre de Chasse, among several others dedicated to the loyalty of medieval canines. Cats. Cats were appreciated not just for their skill of catching mice and other vermin, but also as valuable companions in domestic settings, and especially in the monasteries and abbeys. Unless need compels you, my dear sisters, and your director advises it, you must not keep any animal except a cat. Now if someone needs to keep one, let her see to it that it does not annoy anyone or do any harm to anybody, and that her thoughts are not taken up with it. This was a guide for medieval nuns on how to care for and treat the only animal that they were allowed to keep within the abbey confines. It reflects the view that cats are a frivolous waste of time and food that could have been given to the poor. But for the very religious anchoress, who was voluntarily shut away in their quarters, withdrawn from society, their cat was the only friend they had to alleviate their loneliness. Aldhelm, the abbot of Malmesbury, wrote a riddle about the cat in the early 7th century where he described the animal as faithful and ever vigilant. In early medieval Ireland, there was even a whole segment of the law code devoted to cats. This cat section identified several types of cats such as mousers, herders, guard cats, simple pet cats, and kittens, who were cited as playmates for children. It also gave the recompense that would be available to a person if something was to happen to their cat. One that could purr and catch mice was valued as 3 cows. One that could only purr was worth 1.5 cows. Sort of like my cat Daisy, who's cute but useless. However, in Wales, 10th century laws ruled that a cat should be valued in accordance with its age. It was only worth 1 penny from birth until it opened its eyes, then it was worth 2 pence. Once it had caught a mouse, its value doubled to 4 pence. Royal cats, however, if killed or stolen when guarding the king's barn, were to be valued in a whole different way. The cat's head was to be, quote, set down on a clean level floor and her tail raised up and wheat grains poured over her until they hide the end of her tail. That will be her value. As has always been the case throughout history, the standing of a person dictated how much they and their pets were valued in society. A king's pet dog was worth £1, as was a noble's, whereas a freeman's dog was worth 120 pence, and an unfree man's just 4 pence. The cats themselves could be exempt from punishment if they were to injure a human whilst carrying out their duties. If they were chasing a mouse and someone who had no business being there was tripped up, then it was not the fault of the occupied feline. In medieval Irish law at least, there seemed to be a high respect and tolerance of the domestic cat. Inspired by this, one Irish monk wrote his famous 9th century poem, Pangubane, in praise of his feline friend, who he referred to as a hero who was perfect in his job as a mouse catcher. Isn't that sweet? Concerning cats, Albertus Magnus said they, quote, loved to be lightly stroked by human hands and were playful, especially when they were young. However, he also advised that their ears should be clipped so that the night dew was not able to get in, and the cutting off of their whiskers would cause them to lose their boldness. A woman's best friend. The 14th century saw the importation of cats from Syria into Europe. These were seen as exotic as they had brown fur with black stripes rather than the native grey moggies. Isabella d'Este, Marchesa of Mantua, was so desperate to get her hands on one in 1496 that she sent a letter to Antonio Salimbeni in Venice asking him to find 3 or 4 Syrian cats for her. 2 years later, she was still waiting when another Mantuan courtier spotted one sitting in the windows of a Venetian house. Unusually, it was wearing a collar decorated with little bells, making it obvious that the animal was kept purely as a pet and not a vermin catcher. The owner, who the courtier described as being the oldest woman he had ever seen, could not be persuaded to give up the cat despite the mention of Isabella's name and offers of money. He was similarly disappointed when he tried to negotiate with the woman's son. He determined that, quote, they were both asses. This does, however, show the love that people had for their pets, even in the face of large financial incentives. In the end, Isabella owned many cats, calling one of them Martino. On the sad occasion of his death, the cat was given a decent burial with a sermon preached at the graveside. A fellow Italian named Francesco Becchetti wrote an elegy about his dead feline, describing how he had lost his beloved, which used to sleep either on his shoulder when he was working on his poetry or on his feet at night. He also lamented how the mice now roamed around freely, annoying him. Becchetti went as far as wishing for 2 new stars to appear in the night sky to represent his beloved pet's eyes. I'm not crying, you are. Birds. From the 12th century, bird sellers popped up in Paris, and there is mention of tradesmen near to Notre Dame who specialized in selling both birds that were meant to be eaten and others that were meant to be kept as pets. These caged birds included parrots, sparrows, nightingales, and starlings. By 1292, master bird sellers were employing craftsmen to make their cages. Some were very elaborate, made from gold and jewel encrusted. Again, we can turn to Le Ménager de Paris as a source on medieval pet care. This time, our elderly Parisian merchant explains how his wife should constantly replenish the water of caged birds and, quote, "Let carded wool and feathers be put in the aviary to make their nests, and thus have I seen turtle doves, linnets, and goldfinches rear their young. You should also give them caterpillars, worms, flies, spiders, grasshoppers, butterflies, fresh hempen leaf, moistened and soaked spiders, caterpillars, and such like things which be soft to the little bird's beak, which is tender." Other small mammals that were regularly kept as pets by the medievals included squirrels and monkeys. Both were very well liked among the elite ladies and can be seen in illustrations wearing collars and leads. Monkeys were very popular with the higher members of the clergy, who were well known for spoiling them with rich food. It would seem that by the very end of the Middle Ages, more and more medievals were keeping pets, not just for their value as a working animal, but also for their loyalty and friendship. And it would seem that the type of pet which they chose depended on their status and gender. Thank you for watching this episode on Medieval Madness. I'm gonna go cuddle my dog, and I'll see you next week for another video. Cheers! When a medieval death occurred in England, an official appointed by the crown and known as the coroner was responsible for finding out what happened. By the 13th century, there were 4 coroners in every county. Each one of them had a deputy who would sometimes hold an inquest. Their duties extended to the range of criminal matters, not just a violent or sudden death. But if that was thought to be the case, then the coroner and the sheriff would swear in a jury of local men to investigate how the victim had died. These investigations were chronicled in the coroner's rolls. For the medievals, carrying weapons was part of daily life. Male honor had to be safeguarded at all costs, and arguments could very quickly get out of hand. Many of these records from the coroner's rolls in London during the late 13th and 14th centuries have survived. Let's go back in time and have a look at some of the cases from the capital of the Kingdom of England, which the cleric William Fitzstephen describes as, quote, "one of the most renowned cities, possessing above others abundant wealth, extensive commerce, great grandeur, and significance." Nowadays, it just has incredibly overpriced rent and my friend Hammond. Hey Hammond. Welcome to Medieval Madness. The death of Michael Cardoyle. On the Friday after 30th of November, which was the feast of St. Andrew, word came to the coroner and the sheriffs that a man named Michael Cardoyle lay dead at his home in the ward of Thomas Romaine. The death was thought to be suspicious, so Thomas ordered 3 good men from the nearest wards to go with him and investigate. Witnesses said that on the hour of Vespers, on the Thursday before, a man named Master John de Elmenham and his brother Robert were standing at the door of St. Peter de Wodestraat's church near the New Cross in Chep. The now deceased Michael was sitting in a booth at the goldsmithery, and when he saw John and Robert, he got up and went to sit at the booth of John Disier instead. Because there was a bad feeling between Michael and the 2 brothers, an argument broke out. Then Robert pulled out an Irish knife and stabbed Michael in the left breast, making a 1-inch wide wound. Michael held on until midnight, but then he died. After committing the crime, Robert immediately took refuge in the Church of St. Mary Magdalene de Milkstrait. He was still holding the knife as he made his way there. John also drew a knife called a misericord and ran all the way to the church with his brother to protect him. He then entered his home nearby and escaped by climbing up a gutter to the Church of All Hallows de Honelane. Both men refused to give themselves up. The belongings of Master John and Robert de Elmenham were valued at 65 shillings and were confiscated by Sheriff Richard de Camps. Later, Robert applied for the King's Charter of Peace to protest his innocence. During the Middle Ages, once a fugitive entered a church, the right of sanctuary remained sacred, and you could not be arrested. Local officials would often plan for a church to be watched in case a suspect tried to leave. Once there, the accused might be able to arrange some sort of deal for their freedom, like Robert de Elmenham. Usually though, a fugitive would go from their 40-day sanctuary straight into permanent exile. This banishment might be from the city, the region, or even the country. Another case of claiming sanctuary occurred when a man named William Brocashevd ran into the church of St. Swithin de Candlewick. It was in December on the Sunday before the feast of St. Nicholas. William confessed to the murder of his wife Annabel. He refused to surrender and later absconded. His possessions were valued at 2 shillings and were confiscated by Sheriff Luke de Havering. The Two Christians. On Monday the 1st of November, which was All Saints' Day in the year 1300, the coroner and the sheriffs were informed that Christina Morrell was dead, and her death was not rightful. She died at the home of her husband, William the Tailor, which he rented from Thomas Romin in the parish of St. Mary de Alder Mary Church. The coroner and sheriffs took good men with them to carefully examine how the death had occurred. On the Friday before, at dusk, 2 men, one named Raymond Bernard and the other Peter de Artois, were walking past William's house when Raymond entered without invitation and found William in the private quarters of his home. Raymond accused William of selling a coat that was meant for him. A fight broke out and Raymond attacked William. Christina tried to stop the altercation and got between the 2 men. Raymond kicked her just above the navel with his foot and she fell down. She lived on until the following Sunday, but then she died from the said kick in the hour of prime. It was noted that Peter did not aid and abet Raymond, but went home as Raymond entered the house. After the crime, Raymond went to the hostel where he was staying with Peter. He was later informed of Christina's death by his mistress Margot. He immediately ran away with her to an unknown location. The body was viewed and the stomach was indeed blue and inflamed below the navel. According to the time of year, prime began at about 6 o'clock. Christina de Maistre's story was a different one altogether though. She was found dead in the churchyard of St. Mary de Walcherchaw in the ward of Walbrock. On Monday the 20th of November 1301, the coroner John de Clerk and the sheriffs of London were informed of the death, and they proceeded to investigate with good men. They found that at dusk on the Sunday before, William de Salray of Kershalton met Christina in the east corner of the churchyard, and he asked her to stay with him for the night. She refused and tried to run away, but William became very angry and drew out an Irish knife. He stabbed Christina under her right shoulder, causing a wound that was 6 inches deep and 1 inch long. Immediately after the crime, there was a cry, and William was captured and taken to Newgate Prison. The body was viewed and the wound was seen. William was taken before the justices at Newgate on the 30th of November, which was just before the feast of St. Andrew. The jury condemned him to death, and he was hanged. Another woman died in much stranger circumstances. On the 25th of December, being the eve of the Nativity, 1300, the coroner and sheriffs were told that Joanna de Shering of Canterbury had drowned somewhere between the Tower of London and the Hospital of St. Catherine in the ward of Portsoken. Having gathered good men from both within and without the parish, the coroner went to find out the circumstances of the death. On Friday the 21st of December, before the Feast of St. Thomas, Joanna ran to the gate of Billingsgate, being chased by Lawrence Lepolter, the king's poulterer who was in charge of looking after the monarch's chickens and other fowl. It was said that Lawrence somehow incited Joanna to drown herself. Asked why Lawrence had acted in that way or why Joanna had thrown herself in the River Thames, no one seemed to know, but there were no other suspects. There were no visible wounds on the body, and Lawrence was taken to Newgate. He was later acquitted by a jury on Wednesday after the Feast of St. Hilary on 13th of January 1301. Edmund de Breckles. It was on Trinity Sunday the 10th of June 1324 that the body of Edmund, who was a chaplain, was found in the house of John de Maltone and Juliana Ounsole in the ward of Bishopgate. On inquiry, the coroner found that on the Saturday prior, Edmund was laying with his concubine Juliana in the solar of his house. It was after the hour of curfew when John de Maltone deliberately and with, quote, malice afterthought, stabbed Edmund in the belly and killed him instantly. Once he was dead, Juliana ran away with John to the Church of St. Helens in Bishopgate to claim the right of sanctuary. Inside, John confessed himself to be, quote, a felon of the Lord, the King, in front of the coroner and the sheriffs. Juliana also confessed to being an accomplice. Their possessions were confiscated, which comprised of, among other things, blankets, carpets and clothes, a trunk of small things worth 12 pence, an ear cushion worth 6 pence, a parcel of woolen thread worth 2 pence, and 2 brass pots worth 4 shillings. Although the chattels were worth 32 shillings, for which Sheriff Adam de Salisbury would answer. Later, on Wednesday the 13th of June, John came out of the church and stood in St. Helen's churchyard. He confessed his sin to the coroner and the Sheriff of London and agreed to leave England right away. He was given 4 days to reach the port of Dover and then leave by ship on the first tide. Juliana was also sentenced to abjure the realm. She stayed in the church for another month until the 20th of July. She also chose to leave from the port of Dover. The culprits would have both been accompanied to the ship, and if either of them were ever to return to England and were caught, they would be arrested for their crime. A conspiracy. The Saturday after the feast of St. Philip and St. James 1337, being the 1st of May, the coroner and his men were called to a suspicious death of a chaplain named John de Ford. His body had been found in the High Street opposite the Church of St. Michael in the parish of Farndone within. During their inquiries, they found out that an argument had broken out between the chaplain and a woman named Ella, who was the wife of Sir Robert Fills-Payne. Later, Ella had persuaded her brother Hugh Lovell, her servants Hugh de Colne and John Lestrong, another chaplain named Hasolf Neville, and a John de Tyndale to kill the chaplain John de Ford on her behalf. Then, on the, quote, preceding Friday after the hours of Vespers, they waylaid John Leford, and whilst Hasolf engaged him in pleasant conversation, Hugh Lovell, Hugh de Colne and John Lestrong met them, and Hugh Lovell struck John de Ford with a knife on the throat, whilst Hugh de Colne and John Lestrong struck him with long knives on the belly, inflicting mortal wounds of which he died. Then all of the suspects fled, and no one knew where. This record is typical of the coroner's reports, which contained little information about what happened to the suspects of a crime, or indeed what happened, if anything, to Ella for inciting the stabbing in the first place. Whether these suspects were ever caught or put on trial for their alleged crimes remains a mystery. And it's worth remembering that the records were made by groups of local men who had carried out the investigations. It's difficult to know how unbiased they were. They may have known the victim or the accused, or even both. It's also difficult to know how meticulous they were in their examination and questioning. It's possible that without modern crime detection techniques, a lot of their investigating just came down to guesswork. Though the reports do give us a small glimpse into how murder was part of everyday life for the medievals, and they're just fascinating to read nowadays. Thank you for watching this episode of Medieval Madness. Do hope you've enjoyed it, and please do subscribe to the channel if you want to see more videos like this. Cheers, see you next week. Were the Middle Ages really as brutal and sadistic as we imagine today? There are many records from the time that actually do prove the stereotype to be true. Let's face it, we all know what the character Marcellus Wallace meant in the film Pulp Fiction when he uttered his famous threat: "I'm going to get medieval on your arse." Oh, it sounds so much cooler when he says it. Welcome to Medieval on Your Arse Madness. We know that people then were just as horrified and frightened by violence as most of us are today. But as far as social relationships went, physical aggression was able to convey a message to both victims and onlookers, especially when it involved the law. The medieval European punishments for the most serious of crimes were spectacular in their ferocity, like being boiled alive for forging money or having the tongue cut out for blasphemy. Even lesser crimes such as theft could leave the prisoner with a back looking like a raw liver from a flogging, or suffering from third-degree burns from branding with a red-hot iron. The Middle Ages really weren't the best time to be caught committing a crime, and the authorities were very serious about their punishments. In the 1290s, one old guy recalled how, when he was young, he saw a murderer hanged. The dead body was then cut down and rehanged in another town for another crime, just to make sure. Degrees of violence. According to the historian Lawrence Stone, the levels of homicide in medieval England were 10 times higher than what they are today. In the UK of 2011, the rate was 1 in 100,000. In the ultra-violent English city of Oxford during the 1340s, the rate was about 110 in 100,000. But with many small villages and towns miles apart from one another and no network of cross-country police, in fact no police force at all, it's easy to see how someone could commit a crime in one place and then quickly escape to another area without being caught. It was also quite normal for people to have weapons such as daggers on their person at all times. The amount of alcohol that was being consumed on a daily basis probably didn't help either. Crimes against women. As is usually the case, women tended to be the victims of cruelty rather than the perpetrators. Many acts of domestic violence that society tends not to accept today were deemed as an acceptable punishment for a wife from her husband for anything seen as a transgression by him within the marriage. Sometimes some of these incidents appear in the records of church courts, but only if the violence resulted in miscarriage, a permanent maiming, or a murder. Like when Thomas Elam attacked Margaret Perman in 1438. After breaking into her home, he tried to rape her and, quote, feloniously bit Margaret with his teeth so that he ripped off the nose of the said Margaret with that bite and broke 3 of her ribs there. The case was brought to court because Margaret died and Elam was sentenced to be hanged. But that probably wouldn't have happened if they had been a married couple. It's said that the, quote, rule of thumb was used for what was seen as an acceptable level of violent discipline within a marriage. It was okay for a man to beat his wife as long as the stick used was thinner than his thumb. In Paris in 1326, Colin de Barbier battered his wife so hard with a billiard stick that she died. Barbier was found guilty of murder in a secular court. On appeal, though, he claims that he wouldn't have done it if his wife hadn't humiliated him so much by nagging him in public. He said he had not intentionally meant to kill her, only to scare her, but the stick had accidentally entered her thigh just above the knee. He said it was her own fault that she died because she failed to tend the wound properly. Using this defense, Barbier was acquitted. Pardon letters. These letters of remission are like a medieval form of appeal. They were legal documents usually written by the lawyer of an accused person and were sent through the royal chancery to a king or a prince in the hope that they would be granted a pardon. The letter would try to explain why the crime had occurred and what the mitigating circumstances were. If the king would agree that the petitioner's actions were justified, then they would be pardoned, and now guilt-free they could go back to their everyday life. Some of the French pardon letters contain a lot of details about the crime that was committed. 2 men were drinking together in a tavern one evening. The first man decided to leave whilst the other, who was the petitioner of the letter, stayed behind to have a few more pints of ale. Unbeknown to the petitioner, the first man was laying in wait for him outside. As the petitioner left the tavern to make his way home, the troublemaker attacked him and struck him across the face with a dead and rotting cat, causing a cut along his cheek. At this point, the petitioner got really mad and taking out a knife, he stabbed the cat swinger in the arm. Then, because of the, and this is my favourite combination of words we've had so far on this channel, cat swinger's poor personal hygiene, his arm wound festered, and he died from his injury. The man who was swiped across the face with the dead and rotting cat ended up being charged with murder, so he sent a letter of pardon to the French king protesting his innocence. The king did indeed pardon him. Fear and loving. Of course, just like today, medieval crimes were committed for a variety of reasons, including fear, anger, or love. It was for the love of his son that one man found himself charged with a murder. The son was being held in prison and the father decided to stage a breakout. It was whilst the 2 men were in the middle of their escape that a prison guard caught them. The father killed the guard so that he and his son could make their escape together. The father was pardoned due to the, quote, great natural love that he had for his son. Love was often the reason used as an excuse for the use of sexual violence. A man could claim being in love to be excused from rape or murder. And in one gang rape case, fear was cited as a reason for some particularly repugnant behaviour. In a letter of remission, 2 supplicants had taken part in the sexual assault of an unnamed woman, who was said to live with a local priest. The meaning of this would not have been lost on a medieval audience, as the woman would already be seen to have an undesirable reputation. The men claimed that they were forced to have sex with the woman under the threat of violence from the other men that were taking part in the offence. That to not take part meant they would have been maimed or killed in some way, they claimed. Many of the poor women mentioned in these sorts of cases are completely unnamed. It is as though they are worthless in the eyes of the medievals, at least from the viewpoint of the offending men and the royal administrators. One such woman was quite elderly. She was asleep in a room at a hostel, minding her own business, when a man entered. He had been drinking at a nearby tavern, and when he stumbled home, he says that he went to the wrong room by accident, and in his drunken state he climbed into bed with the woman who was in her 70s when he tried to sexually assault her. She woke up and fought back, damaging his private part in the process. So in terrible pain and anger, he attacked her. The woman died a few days later. The man was ridiculously pardoned because it was said that the woman was so old, the authorities weren't sure whether she had died from the violent attack or from old age. The fact that she was described as a woman of ill repute probably made a huge difference to the judgment. Of course, we are only seeing one side of the story when we read these letters of remission. The defendant is not going to tell the whole truth if he or she thinks that the judgment will go against them. Many of these pardon letters show how a major incident can occur from a minor argument, such as the Dutch account of a fight that starts because someone throws a bucket of urine from a second-story window, which is probably a common occurrence at the time. Unfortunately, the urine lands on a passing stranger who, most aggrieved at being covered in someone else's body waste, starts a fight and hits the pish thrower who later dies. It's easy to see how such a little thing can escalate and go so horribly wrong. Carnage. Military aggression and social unrest have always been a great excuse for some bloodshed and butchery. All over Europe for the generation after the Black Death, class tensions were exasperated. The 1358 Jacquerie Revolt has been described as one of the bitterest and bloodiest in French history. The chronicler Froissart described some of the ultra-violence that occurred during that time as, quote, "Certain people of the common villages gathered together without any counsel, and multiplied until they were 1,000, burnt and slew all the gentlemen that they could lay hands on, and forced and ravished ladies and damsels, and did such shameful deeds. Among others they slew a knight, and then put him on a spit, and roasted him in the sight of the lady, his wife, and children, and after that the lady was forced and raped by 10 or 12 of them, and then they made her eat of her husband, and after made her die an evil death with all her children." Eventually, the Parisian merchants who had supported the revolt lost faith after their leader was killed. Ironically, he lost control of and was murdered by a group of his own rebels. The aristocrats then attacked the peasants who were beaten down in a display of more savagery and carnage. It was resentment that triggered the Ciompi uprising in Florence 20 years later. Again, the lower classes felt that they were being overlooked. In the late summer of 1378, the palaces and townhouses of the rich were looted, gutted, and burned. Military aggression. Edward, Prince of Wales, known as the Black Prince, was the eldest son of the English King Edward III. During the 100 Years' War, which was over the succession of the French throne, the Black Prince led a series of raids into France. These were known as chevauchées, a French term meaning ride. These raids into enemy territory were all about laying waste to the buildings and land, causing as much terror as possible onto the people. During the Grand Chevauchée of 1355, when Prince Edward went into the Languedoc region of southern France, he took between 6,000 and 8,000 soldiers with him. He boasted that, quote, "Not a day passed without a town, castle, or fortress being taken." In just one day, 4 towns were burned down. The chronicler Geoffrey the Baker gave a detailed account of the campaign, making a list of the 500 places that were ransacked and burned to ashes over the 2 months, mentioning the sheer terror of the people. Froissart, a native Frenchman, went further and reported on the tremendous slaughter, violence, and mutilations. The raids became more infrequent after the Black Prince's premature death in 1376. It's clear that the medieval society was extraordinarily violent, but it's also clear that the ordinary people were just as worried about it then as we are today. The medievals weren't simply accepting of the violence that went on around them, they found it disturbing, and we know this because they worried about it, talked about it, and wrote about it. Thank you for watching this episode of Medieval Madness. Please do subscribe to the channel if you like these videos, and leave a comment below on any topics you'd like us to look into. Thanks for watching, see you next Friday. Cheers! As I sit here with 3 electric blankets wrapped around me powered on full, my bottom half in a foot spa filled with boiling water, and my hair on fire in an attempt to keep warm, I'm wondering, how did people live or even die during the harshest months of the year in the Middle Ages? How did they stay warm? What did they eat? How did they keep themselves entertained in an age before modern day luxuries like double glazing, God of War Ragnarok, and Netflix? The onset of the Little Ice Age between 1300 until about 1870 meant that the long dark winters of the late Middle Ages were colder and more dangerous. With starvation and death from illness always threatening to strike, winter was a frightening time. Welcome to Medieval Madness. Houses. Most peasant houses were badly insulated and would be full of cold drafts. Made from wood, wattle and daub, European houses were often built on top of earth mounds which helped to keep them warm. A fire which provided heat as well as a place for cooking was often central to the home, with ventilation holes in the roof rather than a central chimney which would lose too much heat and leave the house open to the elements. Of course, this meant that the peasants would reek of smoke as soot would quickly accumulate, especially during the winter months. Sometimes there would be a second floor which would be reached by a ladder and would be used for storage. Tables and beds would be in the main area around the fire. There might be an adjacent area where livestock could be kept. The Vikings of Scandinavia built long, narrow fire pits in their longhouses. These fires were lined with stones which absorbed heat from the flames and allowed it to be distributed throughout the building. Viking longhouses had integrated byres where cattle would be sheltered during the colder months. Not only were cows, chickens and pigs kept as a source of food and raw materials, but also as a source of heat. Using animals for their additional body heat had its drawbacks though. It meant that life indoors was crowded, stinky and noisy, but at least you wouldn't freeze to death if you were spooning a pig with a decent fire blazing, some Marvin Gaye playing in the background, a couple nice bottles of Chateau Cheval Blanc. You get the picture. In houses which used portable braziers, safety was quite a problem, and many houses burned down because of carelessness. Stone buildings are notoriously cold, and glass windows were only for the elite. In the winter months of the 1230s, London's Palace of Westminster was glazed, so that the chamber may not be so windy as it used to be. It did not solve the problem of coldness, but at least it stopped any icy winds from blowing through the building. And in southern France, on the island of Maguelone, the cathedral windows were sealed with plaster during the colder months. Poorer people could only try and cover their wall openings with paper or foliage to prevent drafts. Clothing. A combination of both insulation and radiation were the best ways of keeping warm, and this was done by being near to a heat source and keeping the warmth trapped near to the body with thick clothing. Layering was the easiest way of achieving this. Linen undergarments would be worn beneath woolen outer clothing. Wool was hot, heavy and very itchy, so the linen would act as a barrier between the wool and the skin. It was also so much easier to wash and dry linen clothes. Outdoor clothing such as boots, woolen gloves, scarves and cloaks would be worn indoors in the coldest months. Between the smoke, sweat and animals, indoor winter living for the medievals must have been a particularly pungent time. When out of doors for the more affluent, a metal hand warmer could be obtained. Priests might use these as their hands would become numb during long sermons in a freezing cold church. The thought that the Blessed Sacrament might be dropped during communion was scandalous, so a decorative hand warmer would be used. Made from metal, the hinged ball was perforated and filled with hot charcoal, which would allow the heat to escape and warm the hands without burning them. Bricks and stones would also be heated in the fire and then wrapped in cloth to be taken to bed as a kind of medieval hot water bottle. For those who were wealthy enough, their winter clothing would be fur-lined, and even peasants might use rabbit and lamb skins for the same purpose. Certainly not as glamorous as ermine, but just as effective in keeping out the cold. Of course, permission from the Lord would be needed to catch any game. The sumptuary laws of 1363 made it illegal for anyone other than the wives and daughters of landowning peasants and craftspeople to wear fox, lamb, rabbit, or cat fur. Weather. It wasn't just those in the north that suffered from the cold. In some instances, the weather on mainland Europe could be particularly brutal. During the winter of 1363 to 64, most major rivers and lakes froze over between December and March. At Mainz in Germany, the Rhine was frozen for 70 days. This allowed the town of Cologne, which was further downstream, to hold a market on the icy river. The town of Fosses in Belgium was covered in snow for over 3 months, and even in southern Europe, the Venetian Lagoon, the Atlantic Ocean near to Bordeaux in France, and the estuary of the Rhone were frozen. During February of 1352, the Florentine area of Italy was covered in a snow blanket for over a month. And in 1359, quote, "The snow rose across central Italy to an extraordinary height, so to lighten up the roofs, the snow was thrown into the streets, and some of the towns were blocked with inhabitants trapped for several days in their homes." Bologna saw drifts of up to 18 feet, and in Modena they were even higher. The winter of 1389 saw dramatic, impressive snowfalls in the Lozère region of southern France. A chronicle from the city of Montpellier recorded, quote, "These snowfalls were so great that they destroyed many farmsteads, and many died because their houses fell down on them. Other people died of cold, others of hunger, because people had run out of provisions." This sort of weather was normal in Scandinavian countries and would not have hampered travel and communication as it did further south. The Vikings used various types of skis for hunting and transport. In other parts of Europe, peasants were more likely to have boots and sleighs pulled by horse, which meant that long-distance travel was not an option in bad weather. Isolated and mountainous areas, such as those in Lozère, were unlikely to survive during the harshest winters. Food. In farming communities, the work was endless and there was always something that needed to be done. A lot of preparation and hard work was needed to survive a medieval winter. The gathering of firewood might go on from as early as spring and through the summer, when it would be collected, bundled, and stored. Any food that was harvested in the autumn would need to be preserved in some way to last over the winter months. Pickling, smoking, drying, and brining were often used as ways to make meat and other produce stay fresh for as long as possible. Grains, cereals, and pulses would be dried out and stored in either ceramic or clay pots so that they could be put into potted stews and soups later. Ground up grain could also be added to breads and biscuits. Fresh fruit and berries would be particularly hard to find over the winter months, so they had to be preserved by air drying or pickling in the summer. Goats, cows, and chickens would provide fresh milk and eggs, dairy products being an essential part of the diet. Milk could be made into butter, cheese, or yogurt. In Scandinavia, a sort of sour milk cheese called skyr was eaten in huge quantities. After the milk had been curdled and strained to make cheese, whey is left over as a byproduct and is perfect for use in pickling. A large keg or cask might hold up to 30 litres or 53 pints of whey and could easily hold a side of beef. Salted, smoked and dried lamb, beef, ham and fish could be kept for an extremely long time. Most people would live near to a source of fresh water, whether that would be a well, stream or river, so its collection shouldn't have been a problem. In the case of extreme weather, when people found themselves trapped inside, then the snow itself could be melted and used. The Great Famine. Of course, no one can gather in the crops if there is nothing to harvest. Famines in Europe were thought to have occurred about once every 20 years. The worst of these was the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. Very heavy rain hit in the spring of 1315, causing the crops to fail, which was only the beginning of the misery to come. Crop yield fell by up to a third, as it seemed as though the rains would never end, and animals died because of starvation and disease. The catastrophe caused huge levels of criminal behaviour that included infanticide and cannibalism. Europe did not recover fully until 1322. The famine affected up to 30 million people, wiping out between 1.5 to 3 million. Although the Black Death in the middle of the 14th century was going to be more deadly, the Great Famine was the late Middle Ages' worst natural disaster. Entertainment. After making sure that all maintenance work was taken care of and chores were done, people needed something to do to avoid going stir-crazy. Not much agricultural work could be done in winter, and a lot of time was spent indoors. Medievals might enjoy games in the snow though, such as sledging and ice skating on frozen lakes and rivers using horse shin bones or pieces of polished wood as skates. Later, the skates were made from iron. In Viking communities, snowball fights were thought to have been a great way for training the children for future battles. The Book of Hours from 1460 that belonged to the Duchess of Burgundy shows an illumination of a snowball fight with children and adults, and there are other depictions in frescoes and manuscripts. Indoors time was spent spinning wool, telling stories, or playing games. Board games like chess and backgammon were popular, as were dice games. Vikings tended to play board games of strategy. The nobility combined sport with the procurement of food with their winter boar hunts. One of the most highly read texts in the High Middle Ages was the Secretum Secretorum.
The treatise covers many topics from ethics to astrology and medicine to justice. It states that the dominant humour during the winter season was phlegm, and its harmful effects could be prevented by a change of diet. Hot meats such as pigeon, game and mutton, and fine red wines are recommended. Whereas bloodletting, fornication and laxatives should be avoided, as should any sort of overindulgence. Although it is better to overeat in the colder months rather than at any other time because the natural heat of the body is drawn inwards, and this results in better digestion. Good knowledge to have in the season that includes Christmas. For those living in the southern regions of Europe, which experienced warm temperatures and hot summers, a harsh medieval winter would have come as quite a shock. Those in the northern areas were better experienced and equipped to cope with the ice and snow with their pelts and skis. Dangers came from starvation as food stores would diminish, and lower temperatures always meant the easier spread of disease as people were crammed together indoors. Stockpiles or provisions would help keep the people warm and fed, but for the medievals in the depths of winter, death was never very far away. Thank you for watching this episode of Medieval Madness. Do hope you're staying warm this winter, and we'll see you next Friday for another episode. Cheers! From the beginnings of civilization, humans have always looked up to the heavens in wonder. Sightings of stars and planets, comets and eclipses are awe-inspiring and help us to try and understand our place in the cosmos. Technological advances made just over the last few decades with larger and more powerful equipment mean that we can now probe much deeper into the unknown universe of countless galaxies, planets and stars to understand its origin and growth. We know about pulsars, quasars, dark matter and black holes that all exist together within the vast infinity of space. You can imagine the medievals looking up into space, and with little scientific understanding and no explanations, we can understand why one might attribute it to God. In today's episode, we're going to have a look at what medieval people thought about space. Welcome to Medieval Madness. The science of God. Faith and science were intertwined during the Middle Ages. Both the sciences and the humanities were studied in the universities. There were 7 liberal arts: grammar, rhetoric, music, geography, logic, arithmetic, and astronomy, which, being the study of the planets and other cosmological phenomena, was the basis for astrology. The latter tried to connect any celestial happenings with events and human concerns here on Earth. In the Middle Ages, almost everyone believed that what happened up in the stars affected their daily lives. Of course, for the medievals, the world and everything in the universe was created by God, and in that way miracles could and did happen. But people didn't just rely on miracles. Along with their prayers and visits to churches and cathedrals, they also put some faith in medicine and visited healers. It wasn't a one or the other type of thing. Science and God went together because God was responsible for everything in creation. Much of what motivated the medievals was the idea of becoming closer to God. Whether that was by reading the Holy Scriptures or by looking at nature and seeing this as evidence of his plan and existence. Astrolabes and quadrants. The use of expensive astronomical instruments was only accessible to anyone with some form of learning. For timekeeping there were sundials, and for travellers, compass dials and navicula, which also measured latitude. Students at university were taught how to use tools such as astrolabes and quadrants to keep track of the skies and forecast the position of the stars and planets. Physicians were also taught how to use these instruments to create horoscopes for their patients. From the 11th century, with the establishment of universities, the curriculum included a better appreciation of astronomy and its instruments. Of course, the use of these tools meant that their users were raised in status as being knowledgeable and creative. In the Treatise on an Astrolabe, which was written in 1391 by the poet and author Geoffrey Chaucer, most famous for the Canterbury Tales, Chaucer gives an astrolabe to his 10-year-old son as he is sent off to university, describing in detail how to use the instrument. Chaucer wrote the treatise in Middle English though, rather than Latin, in the hope of introducing that type of learning to a much wider audience. The instruments provided at Merton College Library in Cambridge were even more expensive than the books. Of the two listed as being there, one cost the university 10 shillings, and the other a hefty 13 shillings and 4 pence. There is evidence that they were borrowed in the same way as books to be brought back, shelved, and then lent out again. There wasn't even any need for someone to go outside and use an astrolabe. Calculations for the location of the sun and stars and the rising and setting of the planets could all be completed indoors. They also had the added bonus of being able to help in the study of geometry as well as astronomy. The quadrant was used to measure astronomical altitudes, and there were several types. Its invention meant that the altitude of the sun could be measured without having to stare directly at it. The rise in status of a knowledgeable student meant that they could go on to have reputable employment too. Graduates could continue their work at a monastery or even find a patron and work at the royal court, possibly becoming a respected inventor or astronomer. During the 14th century, Merton College was one of the most renowned places for astrological research in Western Europe. Teaching focused on calendar reform, plague medicine, astrological instruments, and the understanding of events such as eclipses and conjunctions. As well as universities, monasteries were great places for learning about the universe. By excluding themselves from all outside distractions and concentrating on a mix of holy scripture and the studying of God's creation, medieval monks often found themselves at the cutting edge of scientific discoveries. Astronomical tools were used to determine when Easter and other festivals should be held. Following the 7 canonical hours of prayer was also made easier with instruments. By the middle of the 14th century, the Pope declared that every Benedictine monastery had to send at least one monk out of every 20 to university to study theology and canon law. There would also be opportunities to engage in mathematics and astronomy whilst there. Inspired by his time at Oxford University, the 14th century Benedictine monk Richard of Wallingford invented a huge astronomical clock called the Machina Mundi, as well as 2 other cosmological instruments. One being called the Albion, which found the position of the planets, and the other the Rectangulus, that calculated spherical trigonometry. Another clerical scientist was the 14th century monk John of Westwick, who wrote an instruction manual for a planetary equatorium. This was an instrument that calculated the exact positions of the moon, sun, and planets without the use of complicated mathematical procedures. For some medievals, the universe was a logically organized structure. It was arranged within 7 parallel translucent layers. Each one of the planets moved in a perfect circular orbit within its own sphere. The Sun and the Moon were believed to be planets along with Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Venus, and Mercury. They were the only objects that could be seen in the heavens with the naked eye. All the fixed stars were contained within the 8th sphere, and they were all positioned at exactly the same distance away from Earth. Above that layer was obviously heaven, where God lived with his angels and all the righteous souls who existed in human form. There they waited for the apocalypse at the end of days. At this time, the last judgment would occur, and those who were deemed worthy by God would be saved and join them. The undeserving would be sent into the burning fires of hell with Satan for all eternity. The saved would live with God in heaven in everlasting peace. Most medieval scholars followed the teachings of Greek and Roman philosophers such as Archimedes and Eratosthenes, who was able to work out the circumference of the Earth with great accuracy. Taking their ideas, the medievals studied and refined them. This meant that for them, the Earth was always at the center of the universe and everything else rotated around it. The whole system was controlled by the prime mover, or outermost sphere, which was set into motion by God. These Greek theories were widely used throughout Europe and the Middle East until the 16th century. The idea that everyone in the Middle Ages thought that the Earth was flat is false. Even the Church supported the work of philosophers like Eratosthenes. So it wasn't Columbus who convinced them that the Earth was round. Actually, he thought the Earth was much smaller than Eratosthenes had calculated, and the Church tried to convince him otherwise. Astrometeorology. A story was told by the monk of Saint-Denis. It was during the reign of Charles V of France when the court astrologers were consulted for every little thing. A duel was due to take place, and one of the participants was eager to give himself the advantage. It was advised that he had his armor and weapons made at a specific time so that they would gain the best possible benefits from planetary influence. The duelist was also told to expect particularly fair weather on the date of the contest, and that he would be victorious. The monk was more than a little smug to report that there was actually torrential rain on the day of the sword fight, and the king was able to stop the disagreement from going any further. Hermann of Carinthia, an important translator of 12th century Arabic astronomical works, wrote a book called Liber Imbrium that was specifically about precipitation. At the beginning he says, quote, "For when the sun is in the southern hemisphere and Venus is under its rays, and the moon is in application to it, all of these things presage the coming of torrential rainfall on the same day and in the very same hour." The 13th century bishop and scientist Robert Greathead, although known for having a role in the development of the scientific method, also believed that predicting the weather was a simple process using this method. It would seem that this form of weather forecasting was quite popular too, as instruments of astronomy weren't the only things changing hands for large sums of money. In 1403, one astrometeorological manuscript sold for the equivalent of 520 litres of barley, which at the time was enough to feed a family of 4 for a year. Illness. If the planets were so obviously affecting the weather, as the medievals believed, then it made sense to them that they could also affect the people and cause an imbalance of the humours, leading to illness or a downturn in mood. Only royal physicians were able to access expensive astrolabe, so the more everyday doctor was likely to consult an almanac instead. Between 12 and 20 pages in length, these little booklets were quite common in the later Middle Ages in England. They contained calendars of lunar eclipses and solar eclipses, lunar tables and drawings of urine containers, Vane Man, and Zodiac Man. The Vane Man diagram showed the location of, you guessed it, the veins and arteries of the body, whilst the signs of the zodiac, which were thought to have influence over a person, were labelled on Zodiac Man. Every zodiac sign represented a part of the body, whether it was inside or out. Many seem quite random, such as Gemini influencing the arms and nervous systems, and Libra covering the skin, kidneys, and buttocks. The almanac would be carried around and consulted by the physician, who had to look to the heavens when diagnosing a patient. Looking at the patient's date and time of birth, and working out where the stars and planets were now in comparison to where they were then, or finding the constellation that the moon was in when the patient had their first symptoms, would help with a diagnosis. Most physicians would have some degree of learning of astrology in order to treat the sick. During the 14th and 15th centuries, it became a fundamental part of the study of medicine in the universities of Italy. It would seem that despite popular opinion, the medievals were thirsty for knowledge about the universe around them, but even the most learned men of the time did get some things completely wrong. Thank you for watching this episode of Medieval Madness. Please do subscribe and leave a comment below if you've got any other topics you want us to cover. Cheers, and I'll see you next week.